It was built for speed and consumed by scale. When the Second World War erupted in the East, German victory was supposed to come through movement. Armor would break the line, infantry would follow, encirclement would end resistance before it could harden. Few formations embodied that vision more completely than Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army, a force designed to strike fast, drive deep, and decide campaigns before time became an enemy. In the early months, it worked. The 4th Panzer Army surged forward with confidence earned through experience and doctrine. Columns advanced at a pace that overwhelmed defenders. Commanders exploited gaps faster than opponents could react. Cities fell, crossings were seized, and entire formations were trapped in sweeping maneuvers that seemed to confirm the promise of mechanized war. But the Eastern Front was not a campaign. It was an environment. From the opening invasion of the Soviet Union, Hoth's army was thrown into a battlefield without limits. Vast distances, fragile infrastructure, and an enemy willing to trade space for survival. Speed, once an advantage, became a liability, as supply lines stretched thin and coordination faltered under scale. The deeper the army advanced, the heavier the pressure became. Fuel ran short, vehicles broke down, roads dissolved into dust or mud. What had been precision maneuver turned into constant improvisation. Every mile gained demanded more resources than the last, and the enemy did not collapse the way doctrine had predicted. Instead, resistance reformed again and again, absorbing losses and returning stronger. The turning point came where movement met reality. At Stalingrad, the 4th Panzer Army found itself fighting not for breakthrough, but for access, locked into a struggle dictated by terrain, weather, and political obsession. What should have been flexibility became constraint. Armor designed for open maneuver was pulled into urban fighting and exposed flanks, where speed could no longer compensate for vulnerability. Winter arrived without mercy. Engines froze. Men fought in temperatures that punished exposure more efficiently than enemy fire. Supply became survival. Attempts to break through to encircled forces revealed the limits of operational power when strategic decisions removed choice. The 4th Panzer Army could still fight, but it could no longer shape events freely. From that point on, the Army's role changed. It fought delaying actions. It absorbed counteroffensives. It struggled to stabilize fronts that shifted faster than reserves could arrive. The Red Army learned. Defensive depth increased. Counterattacks were coordinated at scale. Where once breakthroughs had been exploited, now they were absorbed. Where encirclements had decided campaigns, now they triggered counter-encirclements. The 4th Panzer Army remained dangerous, but it was no longer decisive. Attrition replaced momentum. Equipment losses mounted. Experienced crews disappeared. Replacements arrived faster than they could be trained. The army became a formation fighting to maintain coherence rather than impose collapse. Each withdrawal bought time. Each stand cost irreplaceable strength. The initiative slowly, irreversibly shifted. Hoth's 4th Panzer Army did not fail because it lacked skill or courage. It failed because the war it was built to win no longer existed. The Eastern Front demanded endurance over speed, depth over shock, sustainability over brilliance. By the final years of the war, the 4th Panzer Army fought in retreat. Its movements constrained, its choices narrowed, its operational freedom gone. What remained was professionalism under pressure and the slow erosion of a force designed for a different kind of conflict. The history of Hoth's 4th Panzer Army is not a simple rise and fall. It is a lesson in how doctrine meets reality, in how scale overwhelms speed, in how modern war punishes forces built for decisive moments when faced with endless struggle. Before we move deeper into this story, take a second to ground it in the present. Where are you listening from right now? And what hour has the world settled into around you? Is this playing late at night, with the day finally quiet, or during a long stretch of work, travel, or waiting where history fills the space? However you found this moment, let it slow for a bit. The Eastern Front didn't move quickly for those who lived it, and neither should this story. This is the story of Hoth's 4th Panzer Army, a formation that began the war at full momentum and was ground down by a front that refused to end. Kazan, Soviet Russia, summer 1932. In a dusty field 300 miles east of Moscow, A German officer stands watching wooden mock-ups of tanks roll across the steppe. Hermann Hoth is 46 years old, methodical, and entirely illegal. The Treaty of Versailles forbids Germany from possessing tanks, training tank crews, or even thinking too carefully about armored warfare. Yet here he stands, notebook in hand, timing how long it takes these fake panzers to execute a flanking maneuver. The wooden frames mounted on automobile chassis clatter and bounce. Soviet instructors shout corrections in broken German. Hoth writes everything down. He understands something most generals of his generation refuse to accept. The next war will not be won in trenches. It will be won by the side that moves fastest, strikes deepest, and thinks furthest ahead. In this forbidden training ground, hidden from the world's eyes, he is learning exactly how to do that. The path that brought Hoth to this clandestine base began in the ashes of the previous war. And it's born in 1885 to a military family in Neuruppin, Prussia. Hoth entered the Imperial German Army as a young lieutenant in 1904. He fought through the First World War as an infantry officer, experiencing the grinding horror of the Western Front firsthand. He saw hundreds of thousands of men die for gains measured in yards. He watched artillery barrages that lasted weeks, achieved nothing but craters and corpses. When Germany surrendered in 1918, Hoth was among the officers who understood that everything about how they had fought was obsolete. The question was, what would replace it? While other defeated officers nursed grievances or clung to outdated doctrines, Hoth began to study. He read British theorist J.F.C. Fuller on mechanized warfare. He analyzed the tank deployments at Cambrai and Amiens. He recognized that armored vehicles, properly employed, could restore mobility to battlefields that had become static killing grounds. But understanding theory and implementing practice were entirely different challenges. The Treaty of Versailles reduced the German army to 100,000 men and explicitly prohibited tanks, military aircraft, and heavy artillery. Germany's generals faced a choice: accept permanent military inferiority or find creative ways around the restrictions. The Weimar Republic chose creativity. Secret protocols with the Soviet Union, signed at Rapallo in 1922, allowed German officers to train on forbidden weapons at concealed Soviet facilities. Hoth volunteered immediately. Between 1929 and 1933, he made multiple trips to Kazan and other Soviet training centers. And he didn't just observe. He commanded mock tank formations, planned hypothetical operations, and developed detailed tactical procedures. Other German officers treated these exercises as abstract war games. Hoth approached them as dress rehearsals for a real war he was certain would come. What set Hoth apart was his systematic approach to mechanized warfare. In 1935, after Adolf Hitler had openly renounced the Versailles Treaty and begun rebuilding the Wehrmacht, Hoth published a treatise titled Der Panzerkampf, Tank Warfare. The document was remarkable for its specificity. While theorists like Heinz Guderian advocated for mass tank formations breaking through enemy lines, Hoth went further. He outlined exactly how combined arms teams, tanks, motorized infantry, engineers, and artillery moving together should coordinate at every tactical level. He calculated fuel consumption rates for sustained advances. He specified communication protocols between tank commanders and supporting units. He even detailed how to maintain operational tempo through captured territory by establishing mobile repair facilities. Most revolutionary of all, he argued that tank forces should not stop to consolidate gains or wait for infantry to catch up. They should drive deep into enemy rear areas, severing supply lines and command structures, creating psychological collapse faster than the enemy could organize coherent defense. When Hitler began expanding the Wehrmacht in the mid-1930s, Hoth's expertise made him invaluable. In 1935, he took command of the 18th Infantry Division. In 1938, he transferred to lead the 15th Motorized Corps, one of Germany's first operational armored formations. Unlike cavalry divisions hastily equipped with tanks, Hoth's command was purpose-built for mechanized warfare. He drilled his officers relentlessly on speed and initiative. Tank commanders were taught to exploit opportunities without waiting for orders. Infantry learned to mount trucks and move with armor rather than marching behind it. Supply officers practiced delivering fuel and ammunition to units advancing 50 miles per day. By September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, 15th Corps functioned like a machine Hoth had spent a decade designing. The Polish campaign proved it worked. Hoth's forces advanced so rapidly that Polish units attempting to retreat found Germans already blocking their escape routes. But Poland was a proving ground. France would be the test. In May 1940, Hoth commanded the 15th Panzer Corps as part of Army Group A's thrust through the Ardennes forest. The Allied High Command considered the Ardennes impassable to large armored formations, precisely why the Germans chose it. On May 10th, Hoth's tanks began threading through the forest's narrow roads. Allied intelligence detected the movement, but assumed it was a feint. They were catastrophically wrong. On May 13th, Hoth's forces reached the Meuse River at Dinant in Belgium. French defenders expected a pause while Germans brought up artillery and prepared a deliberate crossing. Instead, Hoth attacked immediately. Motorcycle troops seized the bridge before French engineers could demolish it. Tanks rolled across under fire. By nightfall, 15th Corps had established a bridgehead 3 miles deep on the Meuse's western bank. The French 9th Army, responsible for this sector, began to disintegrate. What followed was a masterclass in exploitation that validated everything Hoth had theorized. While other German commanders paused to consolidate or worried about exposed flanks, Hoth drove forward relentlessly. His tanks covered 50 miles in 24 hours, then 50 more. French and British units attempting to form defensive lines discovered Hoth had already passed them. Fuel trucks raced to keep pace with the advancing panzers. When ammunition ran low, supply columns pushed through congested roads to deliver more. Hoth personally traveled in an armored command vehicle near the front, making decisions in real time rather than from distant headquarters. By May 20th, just 10 days after crossing the German border, elements of 15th Corps reached Abbeville on the English Channel. They had advanced 140 miles through supposedly impenetrable terrain and cut the Allied armies in two. The French campaign, which generals had predicted would last years like the previous war, was effectively decided in 3 weeks. The fall of France made Hoth's reputation, but it also revealed limitations he alone seemed to recognize. In June 1940, as Wehrmacht soldiers celebrated in Paris, Hoth was writing after-action reports that praised his troops while noting systemic concerns. Logistics had barely kept pace even against a collapsing enemy. Tank maintenance was inadequate. 30% of his vehicles broke down mechanically rather than from combat damage. Communication between armored spearheads and following infantry often failed, creating dangerous gaps. Most concerning, the entire operation had succeeded, partly because Allied leadership was incompetent and paralyzed. Against a competent enemy with room to maneuver and willingness to trade space for time, these problems would become critical. Hoth submitted his reports to the Army High Command. There's no evidence anyone read them carefully. Germany had just won the greatest military victory in European history. Why worry about hypothetical problems? In July 1941, those hypothetical problems became catastrophically real. Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, with 3 army groups totaling 3 million men. Hoth, promoted to command Panzer Group 3, led the northern spearhead toward Leningrad and Moscow. His command now included 840 tanks, triple his France campaign strength. The opening weeks seemed to vindicate blitzkrieg all over again. Soviet frontier armies shattered under the German onslaught. Hoth's tanks encircled Minsk by June 26th, trapping 290,000 Soviet soldiers. By mid-July, Panzer Group 3 stood 200 miles inside Soviet territory, having advanced farther and faster than in France. German newsreels showed endless columns of Soviet prisoners trudging westward. Hitler publicly predicted the Red Army would collapse within 8 weeks. But Hoth noticed what others ignored. His tanks were advancing, but they were also breaking down at alarming rates. The distances in Russia made France look like a parade ground. Supply trucks were wearing out. And every time they destroyed a Soviet army, another one appeared behind it. By late July 1941, as Panzer Group 3 approached Smolensk, Hoth understood they had entered a different kind of war. The Soviets were learning. They no longer stood and fought in neat defensive lines waiting to be encircled. They conducted fighting withdrawals, trading territory for time while inflicting casualties. They counterattacked German spearheads with fresh tank brigades, forcing Hoth to divert forces from exploitation to defense. Most ominously, the German soldiers began encountering a new Soviet tank they had never seen before, the T-34. It had sloped armor that deflected German 75mm shells. Its wide tracks allowed it to traverse mud that immobilized German panzers. Its 76mm gun could destroy any German tank from ranges where German guns couldn't penetrate it. Hoth reported these encounters to headquarters. The reports were filed away. The advance continued. Moscow lay ahead. That was all that mattered. But Hermann Hoth, the man who had spent a decade learning how mechanized warfare worked, was beginning to suspect that everything they thought they knew was about to be tested beyond its breaking point. June 22, 1941, 3:15 in the morning, Lithuanian border. Lieutenant Ivan Kopsov of the Soviet 5th Tank Division is asleep in his T-26 light tank when the world explodes. German artillery erupts across a 1,000-mile front simultaneously, the largest bombardment in human history. Kopsov jolts awake as shells scream overhead. He scrambles out of his tank into chaos. Soviet airfields are already burning. The Luftwaffe destroyed 1,200 aircraft in the first 3 hours, most of them on the ground. Kopsov's division commander is nowhere to be found. Radio communications are dead. No one knows where the Germans are or in what strength. Then, through the pre-dawn darkness, Kopsov hears them, a low rumble that grows into a mechanical thunder. 840 German tanks of Panzer Group 3 are crossing the border, driving straight toward him. They're not advancing cautiously. They're racing forward at 20 miles per hour, headlights blazing, as if they own the roads already. In a sense, they do. Hermann Hoth's Panzer Group 3 struck into Lithuania and Belarus with a violence that shattered Soviet defensive plans before they could form. The Soviet military had expected a German attack eventually, but assumed it would follow traditional patterns: artillery preparation, infantry assault, gradual advance. Instead, German tanks bypassed Soviet strongpoints entirely, driving for operational depth. By midday on June 22nd, Hoth's lead elements had penetrated 40 miles into Soviet territory. Soviet commanders issued orders to units that no longer existed or couldn't be reached. Entire divisions were cut off from supply and communication within hours. By June 24th, just 2 days into the invasion, Panzer Group 3 had reached Vilnius, the Lithuanian capital, covering 90 miles. Soviet tank brigades attempting to counterattack found themselves hitting empty air. The Germans had already passed them and were attacking their headquarters from behind. The encirclement at Minsk became the first great catastrophe for the Red Army. On June 26th, Hoth's Panzer Group 3 linked with Guderian's Panzer Group 2, completing a massive pincer movement that trapped the Soviet Western Front. Inside the pocket were 22 Soviet divisions, roughly 290,000 soldiers. For the next week, German forces systematically destroyed this trapped army while continuing to drive eastward. The scale of the disaster was unprecedented. As Soviet soldiers surrendered in groups of thousands, having run out of ammunition, fuel, and hope. Equipment losses were staggering. The Western Front lost 2,500 tanks in the Minsk pocket alone. But what shocked Hoth and his officers was the continuing Soviet resistance. Even trapped and doomed, Soviet units fought with a ferocity German soldiers hadn't encountered in Poland or France. Breakout attempts continued until the last Soviet forces were eliminated. It was Germany's greatest tactical victory yet, and the first hint that this enemy was different. The human cost of blitzkrieg speed became visible in those early weeks through countless small moments. Hans Becker, a panzer commander in the 7th Panzer Division, kept a diary that survives in German military archives. His entries from late June capture the exhaustion that accompanied victory. June 27th, advanced 30 miles, saw no combat. June 28th, advanced 40 miles, brief firefight at river crossing. June 29th, repaired transmission most of day. Caught up to division by evening, slept in tank. June 30th. Don't know where we are. Maps insufficient. Crew hasn't bathed in 2 weeks. Becker's experience was typical. Tank crews were advancing so rapidly that they had no time for basic maintenance or rest. They ate while driving. They slept in their tanks during brief halts. Mechanics worked 18-hour days trying to keep vehicles operational. By early July, 40% of Hoth's tanks were not in combat, but in repair shops, suffering from worn-out engines, broken transmissions, and damaged tracks caused by the brutal pace of operations. Yet the advance continued because it seemed to be working. By July 10th, Panzer Group 3 had reached the land bridge between the western Dvina and Dnieper rivers, 200 miles inside the Soviet Union. They had advanced farther in 3 weeks than the entire German offensive managed in 4 years during World War I. Soviet losses were catastrophic. Over 500,000 prisoners, 4,000 tanks destroyed or captured, and tens of thousands of square miles of territory lost. German newsreels showed confident tank commanders surveying endless horizons. Adolf Hitler declared the Red Army had been decisively defeated and would never recover, but Hermann Hoth was looking at different numbers. His logistics officers reported they were receiving 45% of required fuel supplies. Ammunition deliveries were running 3 days behind consumption. Spare parts for tank repairs were almost non-existent. Units were cannibalizing destroyed vehicles to keep others running. The advance was consuming itself. The first encounter with the Soviet T-34 tank changed German assumptions about technological superiority. On July 16th near Smolensk, a German Panzer battalion reported being attacked by unknown Soviet tanks that seemed impervious to their guns. After-action reports described a medium tank with sloped armor, wide tracks, and a powerful 76mm gun. Standard German 37mm anti-tank guns bounced shells off its armor at normal combat ranges. And even the 50mm guns on newer Panzer III tanks struggled to penetrate, except at close range. Worse, the T-34 could destroy any German tank from distances where German guns were ineffective. Tank commander Ernst Barkmann later wrote, "We were accustomed to superior German engineering. Suddenly we faced a Soviet tank that was faster, better armored, and more powerfully armed than anything we had. It was like discovering your sword is made of tin while the enemy carries steel." The Soviet response to the invasion was chaotic, but increasingly effective. In late July and early August, as Hoth's forces approached Smolensk, they encountered their first sustained Soviet counteroffensive. Fresh Red Army divisions, apparently materialized from nowhere, struck German spearheads repeatedly. These weren't desperate last stands by trapped units. These were planned operations by formations that had been held in reserve and committed deliberately. On August 5th, a particularly violent Soviet attack near Yartsevo hit the 7th Panzer Division while it was refueling. The division lost 78 tanks in 3 days of fighting, the heaviest losses Hoth's command had suffered in a single engagement. German after-action reports noted something troubling. The Soviets were learning. Their tank attacks were better coordinated. Their artillery was being used more effectively. Their commanders were no longer making the catastrophic mistakes of June. By mid-August 1941, Panzer Group 3 had been advancing for 8 weeks and had traveled over 400 miles into Soviet territory. The map showed spectacular gains. But the operational reality told a different story. Hoth's command had started Barbarossa with 840 tanks. Current strength reports listed 320 operational vehicles. The rest were destroyed, broken down, or abandoned for lack of parts. Infantry divisions that were supposed to keep pace with the panzers were still weeks behind, marching on foot through summer heat. This created enormous gaps in the German front, gaps Soviet forces were beginning to exploit. Supply convoys struggled across hundreds of miles of primitive roads that turned to impassable mud after every rainstorm. German soldiers were exhausted, having fought continuously with minimal rest. And winter was coming. Weather forecasters predicted the first snows would arrive by mid-October. Yet no one had prepared winter clothing or equipment, because Hitler had guaranteed the campaign would end before cold weather arrived. The human experience of this grinding advance appears in countless letters German soldiers sent home that summer. A lieutenant in the 3rd Motorized Division wrote to his wife in August, "We keep winning, but it doesn't feel like victory. Yesterday we captured another 1,000 prisoners. They looked like skeletons, but they still fought. We've been eating the same rations for 6 weeks. My boots are falling apart. Command keeps saying Moscow is close, but it never gets closer. The Russians just keep appearing. Where do they all come from?" That question, where do they keep coming from, haunted German commanders as summer turned to autumn. And intelligence reports had predicted the Soviets could field 200 divisions. By September, the Wehrmacht had already destroyed or badly damaged 300 Soviet divisions. Yet the Red Army kept fighting. Soviet factories were evacuating eastward beyond German reach, relocating entire industrial plants to the Urals and Siberia. New divisions were forming from reserves Germany didn't know existed. On September 6, 1941, Adolf Hitler made a fateful decision. He halted the drive toward Moscow and redirected Panzer Group 3 southward to support operations in Ukraine. Hoth argued against the order. His forces were exhausted, but still capable. Moscow was the Soviet Union's political and transportation center. Capture it, and the Soviet war effort might collapse. Diverting south would sacrifice operational momentum for tactical gains. Hitler overruled him. Panzer Group 3 pivoted south and participated in the Encirclement of Kiev, which yielded 600,000 Soviet prisoners, the largest encirclement in military history. But the Kiev operation consumed 5 weeks. When German forces finally resumed the advance toward Moscow in early October, autumn rains had begun. The roads dissolved into bottomless mud that swallowed trucks and exhausted soldiers. And waiting ahead, digging defensive positions around Moscow, was a Soviet army that had gained precious time to prepare. Hermann Hoth had spent the 1930s learning how to execute the perfect mechanized offensive. He was about to discover that perfection has limits when you're advancing into an endless winter against an enemy that refuses to accept defeat. September 12, 1941. A cluttered office in a requisitioned schoolhouse 30 miles behind the front lines. Major Wilhelm Schaefer, a Wehrmacht quartermaster assigned to Panzer Group 3, is doing mathematics that tell him Germany is losing the war, not losing battles. Those are still being won. Losing the fundamental arithmetic of logistics. Schaefer's notebook shows that Hoth's tanks consume approximately 40,000 gallons of fuel per day during active operations. Current delivery rate, 18,000 gallons. The deficit grows every day. He calculates ammunition expenditure versus resupply. Shell consumption exceeds delivery by 32%. Food rations are running 12 days behind schedule. Schaefer writes a report to Army Group Center, explaining that Panzer Group 3 cannot sustain offensive operations at current supply rates. The report goes up the chain of command. Nothing changes. Fuel trucks that don't exist cannot deliver gasoline that isn't there. But the orders keep coming. Advance, encircle, destroy, advance again. The German supply crisis in the Soviet Union was rooted in assumptions that proved catastrophically wrong. Wehrmacht planners had expected to capture Soviet supply depots and use captured resources to sustain the advance. This worked brilliantly in France, where captured French and British supplies fed German armies for weeks. But the Soviets employed scorched earth tactics, destroying anything useful before retreating. Our German soldiers found burned-out warehouses and demolished rail yards instead of captured supplies. The Germans also assumed they could use Soviet railways to move supplies forward as their armies advanced. But Soviet railways used a broader gauge than European railroads. Russian tracks were 5 feet wide versus the standard European gauge of 4 feet 8.5 inches. Every mile of captured railway had to be physically converted before German trains could use it. Special conversion teams worked frantically, but they could modify only a few miles of track per day. By September, German forces were hundreds of miles ahead of the nearest converted railway. The result was total dependence on trucks operating across impossible distances on non-existent roads. In France, German supply trucks had averaged 112 miles per day on well-maintained paved highways. In Russia, the same trucks averaged 23 miles per day on dirt roads that varied between dust clouds and dry weather and impassable swamps when it rained. Trucks designed for European conditions were breaking down catastrophically under Russian use. Axles snapped, engines overheated, transmissions failed. By October, Army Group Center had lost over 40% of its motor transport vehicles to mechanical breakdown. Not combat damage, but simple wear and tear. This forced the Wehrmacht to requisition horses from occupied territories. By late 1941, Army Group Center was using 600,000 horses for transportation and logistics. It was a startling reversal. The army that pioneered mechanized blitzkrieg was increasingly dependent on animals for supply, just like armies in previous centuries. The weather transformed the crisis from serious to catastrophic. The first heavy rains came in early October, right as the Wehrmacht was resuming its drive toward Moscow. Within days, Russian roads ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. The ground became a soup of mud so deep that trucks sank to their axles and had to be abandoned. Soldiers described roads where 100-vehicle convoys would take 6 hours to move 3 miles. Tanks leaving the roads to bypass traffic jams became hopelessly bogged down, requiring hours of work by exhausted crews to extract them. Panzer Commander Heinz Werner Schmidt wrote, "We are not fighting the Russians, we are fighting the mud." It swallows everything: trucks, tanks, artillery pieces. Soldiers sink to their knees with every step. How do you advance when you can barely move? Supply deliveries that were already inadequate in September became nearly impossible in October. Fuel tankers scheduled to reach the front in 3 days took 9 days. Ammunition convoys scheduled for 4 days took 12. The combination of distance, weather, and mechanical breakdown created a death spiral for German logistics. As trucks broke down, fewer vehicles were available to haul supplies forward. This meant supply delivery rates fell even further. This meant units at the front had less fuel and ammunition. This meant they advanced more slowly. This meant supply trucks had to travel even greater distances to reach them. And the distance kept growing. By November, and some elements of Panzer Group 3 were operating 400 miles from the nearest German-controlled railhead. Each supply convoy had to traverse that entire distance twice, once forward with supplies, once back to reload. At 20 miles per day, average speed, a round trip took 40 days. Schaefer calculated that to maintain a single panzer division in continuous combat at that range required more trucks than currently existed in all of Army Group Center's supply columns. Then winter arrived, and conditions that were merely terrible became genuinely apocalyptic. On November 3rd, the temperature near Moscow dropped to 8 degrees Fahrenheit, the first hard freeze. German soldiers were still wearing the same summer uniforms they'd worn in June. The Wehrmacht had planned to issue winter clothing, but the quartermasters had predicted the campaign would be over by October. Winter uniforms were still in warehouses in Germany, waiting to be shipped for next year's garrison duties. Soldiers improvised with whatever they could find: stolen Soviet coats, wrapped blankets, newspapers stuffed inside jackets for insulation. It wasn't enough. By mid-November, German hospitals were reporting thousands of frostbite cases per day. Men lost fingers and toes to the cold. The cold affected equipment as catastrophically as it affected men. Tank engines required 2-hour warming fires underneath them before they could start. Machine gun oil froze solid, jamming weapons. Artillery recoil mechanisms ceased functioning in extreme cold, making guns inaccurate or dangerous to fire. The disaster extended to animals as well as machines. Those 600,000 horses that Army Group Center had requisitioned to supplement motor transport began dying in staggering numbers. Horses require enormous amounts of fodder. Each horse needs approximately 20 pounds of grain and hay daily. But supplying forage for 600,000 horses required the same truck convoys that were already failing to deliver fuel and ammunition for fighting units. The horses starved. They froze. They broke legs in the ice and had to be destroyed. By December, Army Group Center had lost 179,000 horses, more horses than Germany lost in the entire French campaign. Dead horses lined the roads, frozen in positions of collapse. Units that had depended on horse-drawn supply wagons found themselves immobilized, unable to move ammunition or evacuate wounded. The mechanized army and the improvised horse-drawn army were both failing simultaneously. Hermann Hoth watched the crisis develop with growing alarm and sent increasingly urgent reports to Army Group Center headquarters. On November 13th, he submitted a detailed logistics assessment stating that 4th Panzer Division had ammunition for 1 day of heavy combat. The division possessed only 43 operational tanks out of its authorized strength of 140. Fuel supplies would support approximately 12 hours of movement. Food rations were sufficient for 4 days. Hoth recommended an operational pause of at least 2 weeks to allow supplies to build up and maintenance to be performed. The recommendation was denied. Adolf Hitler had personally ordered the resumption of the Moscow offensive, knowing the advance would continue regardless of supply state. Hoth's letter to his wife in mid-November reveals his state of mind. "We are being ordered to achieve the impossible with inadequate means. Everyone sees the problem. No one has the authority or willingness to stop. We will reach Moscow, or we will break trying. I fear it will be the latter." The final straw came with the realization that the Soviet Union's industrial capacity far exceeded German intelligence estimates. Throughout the autumn, Soviet factories that had been evacuated eastward were reaching new locations and resuming production. The Soviets were manufacturing tanks, aircraft, and artillery at rates that shocked German planners. Interrogated Soviet prisoners revealed that entire cities' worth of industrial equipment had been loaded onto trains and shipped beyond German reach. By November, Soviet tank production was running at approximately 500 T-34 and KV tanks per month, vastly exceeding German production and more than replacing Soviet losses. German intelligence had predicted the Soviet economy would collapse under the stress of invasion. Instead, it was adapting, relocating, and increasing output. Meanwhile, German production struggled to replace Wehrmacht losses. The Panzer III and IV tanks being shipped to Russia as replacements numbered in the dozens per month, not hundreds. Germany was winning battles while losing the production war. By late November 1941, the Wehrmacht's supply system existed in a state of functional collapse masked by desperate improvisation. Frontline units survived by cannibalizing damaged vehicles for parts, scavenging supplies from destroyed Soviet positions, and requisitioning food from already starving civilian populations. Soldiers traded watches and medals to local Russians for bread and potatoes. Tank crews siphoned fuel from abandoned trucks. Ammunition was carefully rationed. Artillery batteries that had fired hundreds of shells per day in June were now allocated 20 shells per day and told to make every round count. And still, the offensive continued. Hermann Hoth's Panzer Group 3, which had crossed the Soviet border 5 months earlier with 840 tanks in parade ground condition, now fielded barely 200 operational vehicles held together by scavenged parts, crewed by exhausted men wearing inadequate clothing, advancing through Arctic conditions on roads that barely existed. Supplied by a logistics system that had effectively failed, Moscow lay ahead. 60 miles, then 50, then 40. Victory seemed tantalizingly close, but the elastic had already snapped. The German army was still moving forward through sheer momentum, but it no longer possessed the strength to reach its objective or the ability to sustain itself if it did. November 27th, 1941. Dmitrov, USSR, 19 miles north of Moscow. Lieutenant Wolfgang Fischer of the 7th Panzer Division stands in his tank turret using binoculars to scan the horizon. Through the frozen haze, he can see them, the golden domes of the Kremlin catching the weak winter sunlight. Moscow, the objective they'd been advancing toward for 5 months and 400 miles. It's right there. Fischer's division has just advanced farther into the Soviet Union than any German unit in history. They've reached the absolute closest point to Moscow that Wehrmacht forces will ever achieve. Fischer doesn't know it yet, but his tank will never advance another yard eastward. Behind him, invisible to his position, Soviet General Konstantin Rokossovsky is massing 58 fresh divisions for a counteroffensive scheduled to begin in 8 days. The German army has reached the high water mark of its eastern expansion. From this moment, everything will be retreat. The final German offensive toward Moscow began on November 15th, under conditions that would have seemed suicidal if anyone had been willing to admit reality. Panzer Group 3, now redesignated 3rd Panzer Group in an organizational reshuffling, was ordered to attack north of Moscow, while 4th Panzer Group attacked from the south. The plan was to encircle the Soviet capital in a vast pincer movement, exactly as had worked at Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev. But everything was different now. 3rd Panzer Group started the offensive with 320 operational tanks, less than 40% of its authorized strength. Soldiers were suffering from frostbite, malnutrition, and exhaustion after 5 months of continuous combat. Ammunition was severely rationed. Fuel deliveries were sporadic. The temperature was minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Hermann Hoth submitted his assessment that the offensive had minimal chance of success given current conditions. Adolf Hitler's response was unambiguous: attack anyway. The advance achieved initial success through sheer determination. German soldiers, despite everything working against them, remained extraordinarily capable fighters. In the first week, 3rd Panzer Group penetrated Soviet defensive lines and advanced 15 miles toward Moscow. They captured Klin on November 23rd, cutting a major highway into the Soviet capital. The 7th Panzer Division reached Dmitrov on November 27th, that closest point, 19 miles from the Kremlin. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that German will might overcome material reality. Yes, but Soviet resistance was fundamentally different than in the summer. The Red Army units defending Moscow were not the confused, disorganized formations of June. These were fresh divisions from Siberian garrisons, equipped with winter clothing and trained for cold weather combat. They knew the terrain intimately, and they were defending their capital with a desperation that German soldiers hadn't encountered before. The Soviet counteroffensive began on December 5th and shattered German assumptions about Red Army capabilities. At 0500 hours along a 200-mile front around Moscow, Soviet artillery opened fire. Then came the infantry, tens of thousands of soldiers in white winter camouflage moving through the snow. Then came the tanks, including T-34s and heavy KV-1s that German anti-tank weapons struggled to destroy. The assault hit German units that were extended in attack positions with no defensive preparations. 3rd Panzer Group, which had been advancing toward Moscow, suddenly found itself fighting desperately just to hold ground. Soviet forces struck the exposed flanks of German spearheads, threatening to cut them off. Units that had been attacking on November 4th were retreating by December 8th. The retreat was initially tactical, falling back to better defensive positions. But the retreat didn't stop. The experience of German soldiers during the Soviet counteroffensive appears in hundreds of personal accounts and unit war diaries that survive in military archives. And Sergeant Hans Roth of the 299th Infantry Division wrote in his diary on December 9th, "The Russians came out of the forest like ghosts, white uniforms. We couldn't see them until they were 50 meters away. Our machine guns jammed from the cold. The rifles froze. Men were firing pistols because nothing else worked. We fell back a kilometer, then 2 kilometers, then 5. No one says it, but we're running." The retreat became a race against encirclement. Soviet mobile forces were attempting to cut off German spearheads exactly as the Germans had cut off Soviet forces in summer. Tank crews abandoned vehicles that ran out of fuel or broke down, hiking westward through waist-deep snow, trying to reach German lines. And Hermann Hoth found himself fighting a nightmare reversal of everything he had accomplished earlier in the war. The tactics that had brought devastating success in France in the opening months of Barbarossa, rapid movement, deep penetration, exploitation of enemy confusion, were now being used against German forces by the Soviets. Hoth's strength reports from mid-December show the scale of the disaster. 3rd Panzer Group began the Moscow offensive with 320 operational tanks. By December 15th, 40 tanks remained functional. Infantry divisions that had started Barbarossa with 17,000 men were down to 4,000 combat-effective soldiers. Some battalions had been reduced to company strength. Artillery batteries had ammunition for 1 day of combat. And the temperature kept dropping, minus 30 degrees, and minus 40 degrees. Men were dying from exposure faster than from Soviet bullets. On December 16th, Adolf Hitler issued his infamous Stand Fast order, forbidding any retreats and demanding German forces hold their positions regardless of circumstances. The order was meant to prevent panicked collapse, but created impossible situations. Units surrounded by Soviet forces were ordered to hold in place and await relief that never came. Commanders who recommended tactical withdrawals to defensible positions were relieved of command or threatened with court-martial. Hoth argued directly with his superiors that the stand-fast order would result in the piecemeal destruction of Army Group Center. He was overruled. The German army would stand and fight where it was, even if that meant annihilation. In practice, and many commanders ignored the order when the alternative was obvious destruction, conducting local adjustments that were retreats in all but name. But the stand-fast order prevented the organized withdrawal to defensible winter positions that might have stabilized the front. The human cost of the Moscow offensive appears in the casualty statistics that tell a story of unprecedented loss. By December 31st, 1941, Army Group Center, the force group that included Hoth's 3rd Panzer Group, had suffered 103,000 casualties since the Moscow offensive began in November. That exceeded total German casualties for the entire French campaign. Killed, wounded, missing, and frostbite cases were arriving at field hospitals at rates that overwhelmed medical services. Wounded soldiers froze to death in unheated transport trucks before reaching hospitals. Field surgeons amputated frostbitten limbs by the thousands. The Wehrmacht was suffering casualty rates comparable to the worst battles of World War I, but across a vastly larger geographic area with far fewer replacements available. And unlike World War I, there was no stable front line. There were only desperate defensive battles across hundreds of miles of frozen wilderness. The failure before Moscow marked the psychological end of Blitzkrieg as Germany understood it. The doctrine that had brought spectacular victories from Poland to the outskirts of Moscow had been predicated on quick, decisive campaigns against enemies who would collapse under rapid assault. But the Soviet Union had not collapsed. It had absorbed catastrophic losses, over 3 million casualties in 6 months, thousands of tanks destroyed, vast territory occupied, and continued fighting. Soviet industrial production was increasing, not decreasing. New armies kept appearing, and winter had arrived, exposing the fundamental weakness of German logistics and planning. Blitzkrieg required perfect execution over limited distances and favorable conditions. Russia offered none of that. It offered endless space, terrible weather, implacable resistance, and no possibility of quick victory. Hermann Hoth spent Christmas 1941 in a frozen bunker conducting defensive operations. The man who had pioneered mechanized breakthrough operations, who had led victorious advances across Europe, that was now fighting to prevent his command from being destroyed in a Soviet winter counter-offensive. His 3rd Panzer Group fell back 60 miles from Moscow by January, trading space for survival. Units disintegrated or were encircled and destroyed. The operational excellence that had characterized German armored forces began to erode under the strain of continuous defensive combat in impossible conditions. And this was only the beginning. The war that was supposed to have ended by Christmas 1941 would continue for 3 more years. Hermann Hoth would command German forces through most of it, but never again would he lead an offensive with the confidence and material superiority he'd possessed in June. The gates of Moscow had not opened, and in failing to open, they had closed on Germany's hopes for quick victory in the East. Everything that followed would be a slow realization of what that failure meant. March 20th, 1942. Oberkommando des Heeres, German Army High Command, East Prussia. In a conference room dominated by wall-sized maps showing the Eastern Front, staff officers are drawing new organizational charts. Colonel Friedrich Paulus, Chief of Operations, is explaining how Panzer Group 3 will be restructured and renamed. It will become 4th Panzer Army, not just a redesignation, but a fundamental reconception of armored warfare in the East. The room smells of coffee and cigarette smoke. Officers argue about tank allocations, infantry ratios, and supply requirements. They're trying to learn from the Moscow disaster without admitting it was a disaster. Outside, the spring thaw is turning Russian roads into rivers of mud, forcing a temporary operational pause. That pause offers a rare opportunity, time to rebuild, reorganize, and prepare for another summer offensive. The question hanging unspoken in the room is whether they're fixing the right problems. The creation of 4th Panzer Army represented the Wehrmacht's attempt to institutionalize lessons from the 1941 campaign. Panzer Group 3 and 4th Panzer Group had operated as semi-independent formations under Army group control, which created coordination problems and resource conflicts. The new structure would give Panzer armies full administrative authority over their subordinate units and dedicated logistics support. Hermann Hoth, appointed to command the new 4th Panzer Army, was given responsibility for shaping its organization. He insisted on several changes based on Moscow's lessons. First, increased organic infantry assigned directly to panzer divisions rather than following behind. Second, dedicated anti-tank battalions equipped with the latest 50mm and 75mm guns. Third, vastly expanded logistics units including maintenance companies, fuel transport, and mobile repair facilities. The goal was creating a formation that could sustain operations rather than burning out after 6 weeks. The technological upgrades arriving in spring 1942 seemed to address the T-34 problem that had shocked German tank crews the previous summer. On April 8th, the 1st Panzer IV IUSF F-2 tanks reached training grounds near Kharkov. The F-2 mounted a long-barreled 75mm gun that could finally penetrate the T-34's armor at combat ranges. Tank crews training on the new vehicles were impressed. The long 75 could destroy a T-34 at 1,000 meters versus the previous model's ineffective range of 100 meters. Armor penetration tests showed the new gun could defeat 60 millimeters of armor at 1 kilometer. The T-34's frontal armor was 45 millimeters. Simple mathematics suggested the technology gap had closed, but technology was only one variable in an equation that included production, logistics, crew training, and operational doctrine. Germany was fielding better individual tanks. The Soviets were fielding more tanks, period. Bosch 4th Panzer Army's organization, as finalized in May 1942, was the largest armored formation in Wehrmacht history. 4 panzer divisions formed the armored corps: 3rd, 11th, 13th, and 23rd. 3 motorized infantry divisions provided mobile infantry support. 11 standard infantry divisions gave the Army staying power for sustained operations. Supporting units included 4 artillery regiments, 2 anti-aircraft regiments, engineering battalions, and an entire logistics division dedicated solely to supply transport. Total strength: approximately 250,000 men and 1,100 tanks when fully equipped. By comparison, Panzer Group 3 had entered Barbarossa with 840 tanks and half the infantry. On paper, 4th Panzer Army was a formidable instrument. The question was whether German logistics could actually sustain such a massive formation in sustained combat operations deep inside Soviet territory. The training exercises conducted near Kharkov in late May revealed how profoundly the Wehrmacht had changed its tactical approach. Infantry armor coordination drills emphasized combined arms tactics rather than pure tank rushes. Infantry companies practiced mounting half-tracks and advancing alongside panzers, then dismounting to clear enemy positions while tanks provided fire support. The exercises stressed that infantry must secure flanks before armor advances, a direct lesson from Moscow, where exposed tank spearheads had been cut off by Soviet counterattacks. Anti-tank units drilled on establishing defensive positions rapidly, in creating mobile strongpoints that could anchor a defensive line if Soviet forces counterattacked. These were defensive lessons being incorporated into offensive doctrine. The Germans were learning to consolidate gains, not just achieve breakthroughs. Whether this represented genuine adaptation or merely tactical adjustments to an inherently flawed strategy remained to be seen. Adolf Hitler's Directive Number 41, issued on April 5th and distributed to Army commanders in June, outlined the strategic objectives for summer 1942. The operation, codenamed Fall Blau, Case Blue, would focus on southern Russia rather than Moscow. The objectives were economic and strategic: capture the Caucasus oil fields that supplied 86% of Soviet petroleum, seize Stalingrad to cut the Volga River transportation route, and destroy Soviet forces in southern Russia. 4th Panzer Army would serve as the spearhead of Army Group South, leading the advance toward the Don River and beyond. The plan reflected lessons from 1941, focusing on clear economic objectives rather than vague notions of destroying the Red Army. But it also reflected Hitler's growing tendency to pursue multiple objectives simultaneously, a tendency that would have catastrophic consequences. Hermann Hoth's private correspondence from June 1942 reveals a commander who understood both the potential and the dangers of the coming offensive. In a letter to his wife written June 10th, Hoth described 4th Panzer Army as the finest instrument for mobile warfare yet created, provided we use it properly and don't ask it to do the impossible. He noted that logistics support was triple what Panzer Group 3 had received, which should allow sustained operations. But he also observed, "We are concentrating enormous strength in a single formation. This creates opportunity, but also catastrophic vulnerability if we are defeated. The Red Army is not the broken force of last summer. They are learning, they are producing, they are preparing." Hoth's memo to Army Group South headquarters made the same point more formally, warning that concentration of armor created a decisive instrument if successful, but a catastrophic loss if destroyed. The material buildup for Case Blue dwarfed anything the Wehrmacht had attempted before. Supply depots were established across Ukraine, stockpiling fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. Railway conversion teams had spent the winter extending German gauge rail lines eastward, improving supply throughput. Fuel reserves for 4th Panzer Army were calculated to support 4 weeks of continuous operations, vastly better than the hand-to-mouth existence of the Moscow campaign. Ammunition allocations allowed for sustained combat rather than carefully rationed fire. Medical services were expanded with additional field hospitals and evacuation capacity. Even winter clothing was being pre-positioned, despite Hitler's insistence the campaign would end before cold weather. Staff officers remembered the previous year's disaster and prepared anyway, hiding winter equipment requisitions in general supply orders. Oh, the human dimension of preparation appears in the letters and diaries of soldiers joining 4th Panzer Army in spring 1942. Corporal Ernst Hoffmann, assigned to the 11th Panzer Division, wrote to his brother, "We've received new tanks, new uniforms, new equipment. Everything feels professional again, not like the chaos of last winter. The officers say this summer will be different. We're not advancing into endless space. We have clear objectives, cities, rivers, oil fields. We take those, we've won. I want to believe them, but I remember last year's promises too." That mixture of renewed confidence and lingering trauma characterized the German army preparing for Case Blue. They had learned tactical lessons, they had improved equipment and organization, but they were still advancing into Russia, still operating at the end of extended supply lines, still fighting an enemy that had survived everything thrown at it and was growing stronger. On June 10th, 1942, Hermann Hoth assembled his division commanders for final briefings before the offensive. He reviewed objectives, timelines, and coordination procedures. He emphasized the importance of maintaining operational tempo without outrunning supply lines. He stressed that this summer's operations must achieve decisive results because Germany could not sustain another winter campaign under Russian conditions. The briefing's tone was professional and confident, but Hoth included one element absent from most Wehrmacht operational briefings: a discussion of what to do if the offensive failed. He outlined fallback positions, withdrawal routes, and defensive procedures. And some staff officers considered this defeatism. Hoth considered it prudence. He had spent the 1930s learning how to execute perfect offensives. He had spent the winter of 1941 learning that even perfect offensives can fail when conditions overwhelm capability. 4th Panzer Army was about to test whether German armored warfare could achieve strategic victory in the East. The next 6 months would provide the answer, and the answer would reshape the entire course of the war. June 28, 1942. Dawn at the Donets River, southern Russia. Wehrmacht propaganda correspondent Lieutenant Hans Steinhoff adjusts his camera, preparing to film 4th Panzer Army's assault crossing. 640 operational tanks are massed behind the riverbank, engines idling in the summer heat. Artillery pounds Soviet positions across the water. Steinhoff has filmed German offensives before, but this feels different. The preparation is meticulous. Pontoon bridges are ready to deploy the moment infantry secures the far bank. Fuel trucks are positioned to follow immediately behind advancing armor. Everything moves with mechanical precision. At precisely 0600 hours, German artillery shifts to deeper targets, and infantry storm boats hit the water. Steinhoff films soldiers paddling across under light resistance, establishing bridgeheads, signaling all clear. By 0800, the first Panzer IV tanks are rolling across pontoon bridges. By noon, 600 Panzers are across the Donets and driving eastward into the summer steppe. Case Blue has begun, and unlike Barbarossa's opening, then everything is working exactly as planned. The opening phase of Case Blue demonstrated that the Wehrmacht had genuinely learned tactical lessons from the previous year's failures. 4th Panzer Army's advance combined the speed of blitzkrieg with the logistical sustainability that had been absent in 1941. Hermann Hoth's operational method prioritized maintaining supply contact over pure speed. Tank formations advanced rapidly, but paused every 48 hours to allow fuel and ammunition convoys to close up. This slower tempo, 12 miles per day versus 20 miles per day in early Barbarossa, kept the advance sustainable. Engineers accompanied the armored spearheads, repairing bridges and clearing obstacles so supply trucks could follow immediately. By July 7th, just 9 days into the offensive, 4th Panzer Army had advanced 120 miles and encircled Soviet forces at Milerovo, capturing 43,000 prisoners. The encirclement worked because infantry secured the pocket while armor continued advancing, preventing the dispersed operations that had plagued previous campaigns. Soviet forces seemed genuinely surprised by the summer offensive's direction and strength. Red Army intelligence had anticipated a renewed assault toward Moscow, not a southern offensive toward the Caucasus. Initial Soviet deployments were configured for defending Moscow's approaches, leaving the southern front undermanned. German intercepts of Soviet radio communications revealed confusion at command levels, contradictory orders, units attempting to retreat into positions already overrun, at headquarters out of contact with subordinate formations. It resembled the chaos of summer 1941, but German commanders who had experienced the previous year noted differences. Soviet units retreated rather than allowing themselves to be encircled. They conducted fighting withdrawals, delaying German advances while preserving their forces. Soviet prisoners taken in early July told interrogators that their units had orders to avoid encirclement at all costs, to trade space for time. The Soviets were learning too. The advance to the Don River showcased Hermann Hoth's evolution as an operational commander. His tactics combined speed with flexibility. When reconnaissance detected strong Soviet defenses, 4th Panzer Army shifted its axis of advance rather than attacking frontally, and Hoth used his superior mobility to find gaps in Soviet defenses, then exploited them before the Soviets could reposition. On July the 15th, when the 23rd Panzer Division encountered heavy resistance near Milerovo, Hoth redirected the 3rd Panzer Division 40 miles south to find open terrain. The 3rd broke through easily, then turned north to attack the Soviet positions from behind, while the 23rd attacked frontally. The Soviet defenders, caught between two forces, collapsed. 4,200 prisoners, 18 tanks destroyed, and 4th Panzer Army continued eastward. This was operational art at its finest, using mobility and reconnaissance to create favorable tactical situations rather than relying on brute force. The encirclement at Rostov in late July produced Germany's largest haul of prisoners since the Kiev pocket the previous autumn. 4th Panzer Army, advancing from the north, linked with 1st Panzer Army, advancing from the west, trapping Soviet forces defending Rostov-on-Don. The pocket yielded 58,000 prisoners and substantial equipment. More importantly, it secured the gateway to the Caucasus. Rostov controlled the main highway south toward the oil fields. German newsreels filmed endless columns of Soviet prisoners marching westward, tanks rolling through captured cities, triumphant soldiers hoisting swastika flags. The footage was shown in German cinemas to enthusiastic audiences. After the trauma of the previous winter, Case Blue seemed to vindicate claims that German military superiority remained intact. Adolf Hitler watched the newsreels at his headquarters and declared the Red Army was broken. He began planning for post-Soviet territorial arrangements, assuming victory was imminent. The technical improvements in German equipment and tactics were paying visible dividends. The new long-barreled Panzer IV tanks performed excellently against T-34s, achieving kill ratios of 3-to-1 in tank versus tank engagements. German tank crews, now experienced after a year of combat, used superior optics and radios to coordinate attacks that destroyed Soviet armor before it could effectively respond. The rolling artillery preparation that Hoth had pioneered, artillery moving with the advance rather than stopping for bombardment, kept Soviet forces off balance. Soviet defensive positions would be identified by reconnaissance, and hit by moving artillery batteries, then overrun by combined tank infantry teams before defenders could recover. It was blitzkrieg refined, corrected, improved. By the end of July, 4th Panzer Army had achieved an 8-to-1 casualty exchange ratio with Soviet forces, inflicting 8 casualties for every German loss. Tactically, operationally, the offensive was near perfect. Individual German soldiers' accounts from late July captured the mixture of confidence and exhaustion that characterized the advance. Sergeant Otto Karius, a tank commander in the 21st Panzer Division, wrote in his diary, "We advance every day. Sometimes we drive 50 kilometers without seeing serious resistance. Other times we fight through defended villages that cost us casualties and time. But we're always moving forward. The Russians retreat. We pursue. All fuel arrives when needed. Food is adequate. Equipment works. This is what we were promised last year but never received. If this continues, we'll reach our objectives." That conditional, "if this continues," appears frequently in German correspondence. Soldiers could see the progress but remained wary after the previous year's collapse. The advance was working, but Russia was vast. The Germans had advanced 100 miles and were still hundreds of miles from their final objectives. And it was only July. The logistics performance during Case Blue's opening week stood in dramatic contrast to the previous year's failures. Fuel delivery rates exceeded 95% of requirements versus 45% during the Moscow campaign. The improved supply throughput resulted from multiple factors: shorter supply distances, better road conditions in southern Russia compared to the north, more effective use of railways, and dedicated logistics planning. 4th Panzer Army's Logistics Division commander, General Major Hans Rödiger, implemented a hub-and-spoke supply system. Major supply depots were established at captured rail junctions every 100 kilometers. From these hubs, truck convoys ran continuous shuttles to forward units. This created predictable supply flows rather than the chaotic scrambles of the 1941. Tank maintenance improved similarly. Mobile repair companies accompanied combat units, fixing damaged vehicles in the field rather than requiring them to return hundreds of miles to workshops. Yet, underneath the tactical success, strategic warning signs were already visible to those looking carefully. The rapid German advance was capturing territory and prisoners, but it wasn't destroying the Red Army's capacity to resist. Soviet forces were retreating eastward largely intact. German intelligence estimated that Soviet armies in the south had lost approximately 100,000 casualties and 50,000 prisoners in July. But new Soviet divisions kept appearing from deeper in Russia. Interrogated Soviet prisoners revealed that factory towns in the Urals were producing tanks at unprecedented rates. One captured Soviet tank officer told his interrogators that his unit had lost all its tanks in a German attack on July 10th, retreated to a depot on July 15th, and received 20 brand new T-34s on July 20th. The industrial war was running on a different timeline than the battlefield war. Germany was winning battles faster than it could replace its own losses. The Soviet Union was losing battles, but replacing losses faster than Germany could inflict them. Hermann Hoth's situation reports to Army Group South during late July expressed satisfaction with tactical performance, but caution about strategic sustainability. 4th Panzer Army had reached Kotelnikovo, 75 miles from Stalingrad, by the end of July. Tank operational readiness stood at 89%, excellent by any measure. Casualties were light relative to gains achieved. the advance rate of 12 miles per day was sustainable given current logistics support. But Hoth noted that Soviet resistance was stiffening as German forces approached the Volga River. Aerial reconnaissance showed substantial Soviet fortifications being constructed around Stalingrad. Red Army units were fighting harder to delay the German advance, suggesting they were buying time for something. Hoth recommended maintaining concentrated force and driving directly for objectives rather than dispersing to pursue multiple goals. His recommendation was filed and acknowledged. Within days, it would be catastrophically ignored. 4th Panzer Army had just executed 6 weeks of nearly perfect armored warfare. That perfection was about to be thrown away by strategic decisions that violated every principle of concentration of force that Hoth had spent his career mastering. July 23, 1942. The Wolfschanze, Wolf's Lair, Adolf Hitler's field headquarters in East Prussia. In the conference room, where Hitler stands over maps of southern Russia with Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel and General Franz Halder, chief of the General Staff. The maps show 4th Panzer Army approaching Stalingrad from the southwest, while 1st Panzer Army drives toward the Caucasus oil fields 400 miles to the south. Hitler's finger traces both routes simultaneously. He announces his decision: split Army Group South's objectives. Send part of 4th Panzer Army to Stalingrad. Keep part supporting the Caucasus advance. Achieve both objectives simultaneously rather than sequentially. Halder, the professional soldier, begins to object that this violates concentration of force. Hitler cuts him off. The Soviets are collapsing. Now is the time for boldness, for seizing all objectives while the enemy is weak. The decision is made. The orders will go out tonight. 1,300 miles away, Hermann Hoth will receive instructions that fragment his carefully concentrated army and set in motion a catastrophe from which the Wehrmacht will never recover. The strategic logic behind Hitler's Directive No. 45 seemed reasonable if you ignored military fundamentals. 1st Panzer Army was advancing toward the Caucasus oil fields, but needed support breaking through Soviet defenses in the mountains. 4th Panzer Army was approaching Stalingrad and could probably capture it, but the city wasn't the primary objective. The oil fields were. Hitler decided he could achieve both goals by dividing forces. Send half of 4th Panzer Army south to help 1st Panzer Army capture Maikop, Grozny, and Baku. Send the other half northeast to seize Stalingrad. Once Stalingrad fell and the Caucasus was secured, one should reunite the forces for further operations. On paper, with colored pencils on maps in a comfortable headquarters, it looked achievable. In operational reality, it violated the fundamental principle of concentration of force that every military theorist from Sun Tzu to Clausewitz had emphasized. Divide your forces in the face of the enemy, and you risk defeating neither objective while enabling the enemy to defeat you in detail. The orders that reached Hermann Hoth on July 23rd must have seemed designed to induce madness. 4th Panzer Army was to detach 14th Panzer Corps and send it 300 miles south to support 1st Panzer Army's advance toward Maikop. The remaining forces would continue toward Stalingrad, but with half their armored strength. Then, on July 31st, new orders arrived reversing the previous instructions. 14th Panzer Corps would actually remain with 4th Panzer Army for the Stalingrad operation after all. But on August 4th, another order came through. 14th Panzer Corps was indeed being sent south to the Caucasus. Within 2 weeks, 4th Panzer Army received 3 contradictory sets of orders about its own composition and objectives. Units were dispatched south, recalled, dispatched again. Fuel was consumed moving units laterally rather than toward any objective. Operational tempo was destroyed by constant reorganization. The Wehrmacht's greatest armored formation was being used like a fire brigade, rushed from crisis to crisis, never allowed to concentrate on a single objective. The operational consequences became immediately apparent. 4th Panzer Army, which had been advancing toward Stalingrad with 640 operational tanks, now approached the city with only 240 tanks after detaching 14th Panzer Corps southward. Meanwhile, Soviet forces were using the time German units spent reorganizing to fortify Stalingrad's approaches. Red Army engineering units worked frantically to create defensive positions, lay minefields, and prepare the city for defense. Every day, 4th Panzer Army spent moving units sideways instead of forward was a day the Soviets gained for preparation. German aerial reconnaissance reported substantial Soviet reinforcements arriving at Stalingrad via rail and river transport across the Volga. The city's factories were being converted to produce weapons and ammunition on site. The civilian population was being mobilized to dig trenches and build fortifications. A city that might have fallen to a concentrated assault in late July was becoming a fortress by mid-August. The strategic map of southern Russia by mid-August illustrated the problem with geometric clarity. German forces were spread across a front spanning 480 miles from Stalingrad in the north to the Caucasus approaches in the south. Army Group South's forces were advancing on diverging axes, moving farther apart with each day. This created a situation where forces were too dispersed to support each other, but not concentrated enough to overwhelm defenders on either axis. If Soviet forces counterattacked against 1st Panzer Army in the Caucasus, 4th Panzer Army was too far north to help. If Soviet forces counterattacked against 4th Panzer Army at Stalingrad, 1st Panzer Army was too far south to help. The distance between the two axes made mutual support impossible. German forces were operating on what military theorists call interior lines. The enemy could shift reserves between threatened sectors faster than German forces could shift between their own dispersed objectives. The arguments between Hitler and his general staff over the divided objectives were documented in Franz Halder's diary and became increasingly acrimonious through August. Halder, one of Germany's most competent military planners, repeatedly urged concentration of effort on a single objective. Capture the Caucasus oil fields first, he argued, then turn north to Stalingrad with concentrated force. Or capture Stalingrad first. It's securing the Volga River line, then drive south with full strength. Attempting both simultaneously divided forces and invited defeat. Hitler responded that the general staff lacked boldness, vision, and understanding of the Soviets' weakness. The Red Army was beaten, he insisted. Now was the time to seize everything within reach. When Halder persisted in objecting, Hitler accused him of defeatism. The strategic debate had devolved into questions of will and ideology rather than operational analysis. In September, Halder would be relieved of his position as Chief of General Staff, partially for his continued objections to the divided objectives. Hermann Hoth's requests for clarification of priorities went through channels 4 times between late July and mid-August. Each time, as he asked straightforward questions. What is 4th Panzer Army's primary objective, Stalingrad or supporting the Caucasus advance? Which objective takes priority if achieving both proves impossible? Should 4th Panzer Army consolidate at Stalingrad and reduce the city methodically, or attempt rapid capture at risk of higher casualties? What forces will be available and when? The responses were bureaucratic non-answers that essentially reiterated the orders without clarifying the inherent contradictions. In practice, this meant Hoth was expected to achieve multiple objectives simultaneously with insufficient forces while receiving contradictory guidance about priorities. It was a recipe for operational paralysis, and Hoth knew it. His August 10th letter to his wife is revealing, "I am being asked to accomplish 2 tasks that require different forces, different approaches, and different timelines. When I ask which matters more, I am told both matter equally. This is not strategy. This is wishful thinking being imposed on military operations." The human cost of the divided objectives appears in the war diaries of units being shifted between axes. The 3rd Panzer Division, originally advancing toward Stalingrad, was detached on August 4th and sent south toward the Caucasus to support operations near Maikop. The division's war diary notes, August 4th, received orders to march south. August 5th, covered 65 kilometers south. August 6th, covered 70 kilometers south. August 7th, covered 55 kilometers south. Our increasing mechanical breakdowns from road march. August 8th, reached assembly area near Tikhoretsk. August 9th, received orders to return north toward Stalingrad. August 10th, began return march. The division spent 6 days and consumed tens of thousands of liters of fuel, accomplishing exactly nothing. Tanks wore out their transmissions and suspension systems driving across southern Russia's roads. Crews were exhausted from constant movement, and all the while, Soviet forces were strengthening their positions. The economic objectives that supposedly justified the divided effort, the Caucasus oil fields, were themselves problematic even if captured. German economic planners had calculated that seizing the Maikop, Grozny, Yok and Baku oil fields would solve Germany's chronic fuel shortages and provide the petroleum needed for continued military operations. But this calculation ignored critical realities. First, the Soviets would almost certainly destroy the oil infrastructure before German capture, as they had destroyed everything else during their retreats. Second, even undamaged oil fields required months or years to begin significant production after occupation. Third, the captured oil would need to be transported back to Germany across hundreds of miles of territory, vulnerable to Soviet interdiction. Fourth, Germany lacked the refining capacity to process Soviet crude oil, which had different characteristics than Romanian or German synthetic fuel. The entire strategic rationale for the Caucasus operation was based on economic assumptions that didn't withstand scrutiny, but those assumptions drove operational decisions that dispersed German forces across an impossibly wide front. By August 17th, as 4th Panzer Army finally began concentrated operations towards Stalingrad with its reduced forces, the window for easy victory had closed. Soviet General Vasily Chuikov had arrived to take command of the 62nd Army defending Stalingrad. He was implementing a defensive doctrine specifically designed to negate German armored advantages, fortify every building, fight at close range where German tanks and aircraft lost effectiveness, maintain positions on both banks of the Volga to ensure continuous resupply. The city Stalin ordered defended at all costs was being prepared for exactly that. And approaching it was a 4th Panzer Army that had been fragmented, dispersed, reorganized, and weakened by strategic confusion. Hermann Hoth had spent 6 weeks executing a nearly perfect armored offensive. Then his army had been split by decisions made 800 miles away by a dictator who believed it could overcome operational reality. The fork in the road had been reached. Germany took both paths simultaneously, and by taking both, it would succeed at neither. August 23, 1942. Obergefreiter Klaus Fischer of the 71st Infantry Division watches Stalingrad burn. The Luftwaffe has just conducted the largest air raid on a Soviet city since the war began. 600 aircraft dropping incendiary and high-explosive bombs for 12 continuous hours. The wooden buildings of Stalingrad's residential districts are engulfed in flames. Black smoke rises thousands of feet. Fischer expects his division will enter ruins and find scattered resistance from demoralized survivors. That's how it worked at Warsaw, Rotterdam, and other cities subjected to aerial bombardment. Break the city, break the defender's will, occupy the rubble. Fischer's regiment crosses into Stalingrad's outskirts on September 13th. They advance 3 blocks, then the shooting starts. Soviet soldiers firing from cellars, from sewers, from inside ruined buildings that seemed empty. And Fischer's company loses 14 men in 20 minutes, capturing a single apartment building. It takes them 2 more hours to clear the building room by room. At the end of the day, Fischer's regiment has advanced 300 meters and suffered 107 casualties. This is not how armored warfare works. This is industrial-era siege warfare conducted in the ruins of an industrial city. And it has only just begun. The battle for Stalingrad exposed the fundamental limitation of German armored doctrine. It had no answer for urban combat. Everything Hoth and other panzer commanders had perfected — speed, mobility, deep penetration, psychological shock — became irrelevant in city streets. Tanks advancing through urban terrain were vulnerable to close-range anti-tank weapons fired from buildings or basements. A single Soviet soldier with an anti-tank rifle could disable a Panzer IV by shooting its side armor at 50 meters range. German tanks advancing in column down streets presented perfect targets for Soviet anti-tank guns positioned in upper floors. The 76th Panzer Division lost 23 tanks in 4 days, fighting in Stalingrad's factory district, not to other tanks, but to hidden anti-tank guns, mines, and improvised explosives. tanker Hans Becker wrote, "In open country, we hunt Soviet tanks. In the city, we are the hunted. We can't see the enemy until we're already hit. Buildings collapse on tanks. Streets become traps. This isn't tank warfare. This is slaughter." Soviet defensive tactics in Stalingrad were specifically designed to neutralize German advantages. General Chuikov implemented what he called hugging tactics, keeping Soviet frontline positions within 50 meters of German lines at all times. This close proximity prevented German artillery and air support from being used without hitting German troops. It forced combat into close-quarters infantry fights, where Soviet numerical superiority and knowledge of terrain mattered more than German tactical skill or equipment quality. Every building became a fortress. Every basement became a bunker. Every pile of rubble became a defensive position. Soviet engineers turned Stalingrad's ruins into a maze where German soldiers advancing down a street might be attacked from cellars below, windows above, and ruins to either side simultaneously. Clearing a single city block could take days of continuous fighting and cost hundreds of casualties. The combat statistics from Stalingrad's urban fighting reveal why it consumed German strength at unsustainable rates. 4th Panzer Army lost 58% of its remaining armored strength in September and October, fighting inside the city, compared to 12% losses during the entire advance across the steppe in July. Infantry casualties were even worse. German infantry divisions entered Stalingrad at 60% strength after summer casualties, and were reduced to 30% strength after 4 weeks of urban combat. The 299th Infantry Division, which had 17,000 men in June, numbered 4,000 combat-effective soldiers by late October. The casualty evacuation from the city was extremely difficult. Wounded soldiers had to be carried through contested streets under fire to reach aid stations. Many wounded died during evacuation. Many others suffered additional wounds while being carried to safety. The city was consuming German infantry faster than replacements could arrive. The psychological impact of Stalingrad fighting appears throughout German soldiers' letters and diaries. Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann of the 94th Infantry Division kept a diary that was recovered after his death. September entries captured the descent into horror. September 1st, we're attacking Stalingrad. September 8th, constant street fighting. The Russians fight for every building. September 16th, our regiment has been fighting for 2 weeks. We've advanced 1 kilometer. And September 26th, the Russians are not men, but devils that fire won't burn and bullets won't kill. October 4th, every soldier here fears Stalingrad. This is not war, this is extermination. That word, extermination, appears repeatedly in German accounts. The fighting had a totalizing quality unlike anything in previous campaigns. No front lines existed. Combat was continuous, 360 degrees, 24 hours per day. The September assault on the Mamayev Kurgan, a hilltop dominating central Stalingrad, demonstrated the futility of applying conventional tactics to urban terrain. German forces needed the hill to observe Soviet positions and direct artillery fire. They attacked with combined tank infantry teams on September 14th. The tanks reached the hill's base but couldn't climb the debris-covered slopes. Its Soviet anti-tank guns positioned in ruins around the hill destroyed 11 German tanks in 30 minutes. German infantry attacked without armor support and took the hill's crest after 2 days of fighting. Soviet forces counterattacked the next night and retook the hilltop. This pattern repeated for weeks. German assault, Soviet counterattack, positions changing hands daily. By October, the Mamayev Kurgan was a moonscape of overlapping shell craters, littered with destroyed equipment and bodies. Neither side controlled it permanently. Fighting for the hill alone cost the 71st Infantry Division over 1,400 casualties. The hill's military value didn't justify the cost, but Stalingrad had ceased being about rational military calculation. It had become symbolic, a test of will conducted in blood. The largest German assault, launched October 14th, represented a final attempt to capture the city through overwhelming force. 4th Panzer Army and 6th Army coordinated attacks across the entire Stalingrad front. 5 German divisions attacked simultaneously, supported by massed artillery and 300 aircraft providing close air support. The objective was Stalingrad's three factory complexes: the Red October steel plant, the Barrancati gun factory, and the Dzerzhinsky tractor factory. Capturing the factories would split Soviet defensive positions and allow German forces to reach the Volga River, severing Soviet supply lines. The assault gained ground. German forces advanced between 200 and 800 meters across different sectors. But the cost was catastrophic: 2,400 German casualties in one day. The factories were not captured. Soviet defenders withdrew to inner factory buildings and continued fighting from the machinery and rubble. Production workers joined Red Army soldiers in defending their workplaces. Fighting continued inside the factories for weeks, with Soviet and German soldiers sometimes occupying different floors of the same building. The logistical impossibility of sustaining urban combat became apparent by late October. 4th Panzer Army required continuous supplies of ammunition. Infantry engaged in building-to-building combat expended enormous quantities of rifle and machine gun ammunition, grenades, and explosives. Artillery supporting urban operations fired thousands of shells daily to destroy fortified buildings. But delivering supplies into Stalingrad required crossing open terrain under Soviet artillery observation and air attack. Supply convoys suffered heavy casualties. The division supply dump for the 76th Panzer Division was hit by Soviet artillery on October 20th, destroying 3 days' worth of ammunition. Engineers attempting to construct fortified supply routes were targeted by Soviet snipers. Stalingrad snipers became legendary for their effectiveness, killing German officers and key personnel with precision fire from concealed positions. The most famous Soviet sniper, Vasily Zaitsev, was credited with over 200 kills in the battle. German soldiers learned to avoid unnecessary movement or exposure, but avoiding exposure was impossible in sustained urban combat. By November 11th, the German forces controlled approximately 90% of Stalingrad's territory. They had reached the Volga River on a 500-meter front near the Red October factory. Soviet forces retained only a few small pockets on the western bank and positions on islands in the river. By territorial measurement, Germany had nearly won. But the battle's objective, eliminating Soviet resistance and securing the Volga River line, remained unachieved. The Soviet 62nd Army, though reduced to decimated remnants, continued fighting. Supplies continued reaching them across the Volga at night via boat. Soviet artillery on the river's eastern bank supported defenders on the western bank. Most critically, while German forces focused on Stalingrad, Soviet commanders were preparing something else entirely. Red Army units were massing north and south of the city. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers, thousands of tanks, millions of artillery shells. The Germans fighting in Stalingrad's ruins were about to discover that winning the battle meant nothing if they lost the war around it. Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army had been sucked into urban combat that negated every advantage armored forces possessed. Tanks designed for rapid exploitation across open terrain were being used as pillboxes in street fighting, and while German forces ground themselves down, capturing ruined factories, Marshal Georgy Zhukov was preparing to spring the largest operational trap of the entire war. November 19th, 1942, 7:20 in the morning, 70 miles northwest of Stalingrad, Romanian 3rd Army positions along the Don River. Corporal Mihai Popescu of the 7th Romanian Infantry Division is drinking ersatz coffee in a frozen bunker when the world erupts. 3,500 Soviet artillery pieces open fire simultaneously across a 70-mile front. The bombardment is precisely timed, mathematically calculated for maximum psychological and physical destruction. Shells scream down for 80 minutes without pause. Romanian positions disintegrate. Communications are severed. Bunkers collapse. Soldiers who survived the barrage emerge shell-shocked to see Soviet tanks already crossing the Don River on improvised bridges. T-34s, KV-1s, and thousands of infantry advancing through the snow. The Romanian divisions, equipped with inadequate anti-tank weapons and no armor support, begin to dissolve. By afternoon, entire Romanian regiments are fleeing westward or surrendering en masse. Soviet forces are pouring through gaps 50 miles wide. Operation Uranus, the counter-offensive that will encircle Stalingrad, has begun. and the German forces fighting in the city's ruins have no idea what's happening behind them. The planning for Operation Uranus represented Soviet operational art, evolving beyond German capabilities. Marshal Georgy Zhukov had studied German encirclement operations at Minsk, Kiev, and Vyazma. He understood the mechanics: identify weak points in enemy lines, strike with concentrated armor, drive deep to link pincers, trap the enemy forces between. Throughout October and November, while German attention focused on Stalingrad, Soviet forces had been massing north and south of the city. But the concentration was concealed with extraordinary skill. Troop movements occurred at night. Tanks were camouflaged with white paint and netting. Radio silence was maintained rigorously. Soviet artillery was positioned in forests and depressions invisible to German aerial reconnaissance. German intelligence detected some buildup, but drastically underestimated its scale. German estimates suggested 200 Soviet tanks in the area when the actual number exceeded 894. The Soviet breakthrough on November 19th shattered the Romanian and Hungarian armies protecting 4th Panzer Army's flanks. These Allied contingents had been assigned to static defensive sectors, while German forces concentrated on Stalingrad. And they were equipped with obsolete weapons. Many Romanian units carried French rifles captured in 1940 and Czech anti-tank guns that couldn't penetrate modern Soviet tanks. When Soviet armor attacked, Romanian defenders had no effective response. A single T-34 could destroy an entire Romanian anti-tank position without taking damage. The Romanian soldiers fought initially, but broke when they realized their weapons were ineffective and no German reinforcements were coming. By November 20th, 98,000 Romanian soldiers had been killed, captured, or were fleeing in disorganized retreat. Soviet forces advanced 40 miles in 36 hours, racing toward the link-up point that would complete the encirclement. The southern pincer of Operation Uranus struck on November 20th, as hitting 4th Panzer Army's positions south of Stalingrad. But 4th Panzer Army's situation differed critically from the Romanians. Hoth's forces included actual armored formations capable of fighting back. The 4th Romanian Army positions collapsed, but German units attempted to form defensive lines and counterattack. The 16th Panzer Division fought a delaying action near Kotelnikovo, destroying Soviet tanks and inflicting casualties. But the German forces were outnumbered and dispersed. Units fighting in Stalingrad couldn't be extracted to face the new threat. Units assigned to defensive positions were too weak to hold against massed Soviet armor. The southern Soviet pincer advanced more slowly than the northern, but still gained 30 miles in 3 days. And it was heading for the same objective as the northern pincer, Kalach, on the Don River west of Stalingrad. On November 22nd, the pincers met. Soviet tank forces from the northern and southern attacks linked up near Kalach, approximately 40 miles west of Stalingrad. The encirclement was complete. Trapped inside the pocket were approximately 290,000 German and Allied soldiers, most of the 6th Army, half of 4th Panzer Army, and remnants of Romanian divisions. The pocket measured roughly 30 miles east to west and 25 miles north to south, a substantial area, but completely surrounded by Soviet forces. Immediately, Soviet commanders began establishing inner and outer encirclement lines. The inner ring contained the trapped Germans, and the outer ring faced westward to block German relief attempts. The trap that Zhukov had planned for months had been sprung, and Adolf Hitler, 1,300 miles away at his headquarters, was about to make a decision that would doom everyone inside. Hermann Hoth's situation on November 23rd was simultaneously desperate and clear. Half his army, 2 panzer divisions and supporting units, was trapped inside the Stalingrad pocket. The other half was outside, scattered across southern Russia, trying to establish defensive lines against Soviet forces that had broken through everywhere. Hoth immediately recognized that the trapped forces needed to break out westward while they still had fuel and ammunition to maneuver. He recommended to 6th Army Commander Friedrich Paulus that forces inside the pocket should abandon Stalingrad and attack westward toward Hoth's outside forces. If both groups attacked toward each other, they might break through the encirclement while Soviet positions were still forming. The recommendation was professionally sound and operationally necessary, but it required abandoning Stalingrad, giving up the objective that had consumed 3 months and tens of thousands of casualties. Paulus forwarded Hoth's recommendation to Hitler for permission. Hitler's response came back within hours. No retreat. 6th Army would hold Stalingrad. The Luftwaffe would supply the trapped forces by air until relief arrived. The Luftwaffe's promise to supply the Stalingrad pocket was based on catastrophically optimistic assumptions. Then Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring, commanding the Luftwaffe, assured Hitler that air transport could deliver 300 tons of supplies daily to the pocket, enough to sustain the trapped forces indefinitely. In reality, the calculation was impossible. The Luftwaffe possessed approximately 500 transport aircraft, mostly Junkers 52 trimotors, in the entire Eastern Theater. These aircraft could carry approximately 2 tons of cargo each. Reaching 300 tons daily would require 150 successful flights per day, every day, regardless of weather or enemy action. But Soviet fighters aggressively attacked German transports. Soviet anti-aircraft artillery surrounded the pocket. Winter weather grounded aircraft for days at a time. In practice, the Luftwaffe averaged 94 tons delivered per day, less than 1/3 the promised amount. Soldiers in the pocket were immediately placed on reduced rations. Ammunition was rationed. Fuel deliveries were prioritized for tanks and generators. The pocket's defenders were starving and freezing from the first days of encirclement. The strategic situation, as of late November, represented a complete reversal from early summer. In June, 4th Panzer Army had been advancing victoriously toward the Don River with overwhelming force. Now, half the army was trapped and facing annihilation, while the other half was scattered in defensive positions. The summer's operational successes, the advances, the encirclements, the territorial gains, had all led to this moment of maximum vulnerability. Soviet forces now held the operational initiative, and they could choose where and when to attack. German forces could only react, and every day the encirclement continued, the trapped forces grew weaker while Soviet strength increased. Supply convoys were attacked from the air. Defensive positions were ground down by Soviet artillery. Wounded soldiers died for lack of medical supplies. The temperature dropped to 10 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, then 20 below. Soldiers who had survived the summer campaign were dying of cold and hunger in frozen bunkers. Hermann Hoth's war diary entries from late November show a commander confronting the consequences of strategic decisions he had argued against. November 24th. Pocket forming at Stalingrad contains half of 4th Panzer Army. Recommended immediate breakout. Permission denied. Luftwaffe supply inadequate from first day. November 26th. Soviet forces establishing strong positions around pocket. Relief will be extremely difficult. Gathering what forces remain outside for potential relief operation. November 28th. Weather deteriorating. Soldiers inside pocket on half rations. Fuel critical. Prospects poor. Hoth's assessment was professionally accurate and personally devastating. He had commanded these soldiers for months. He had led them to victory after victory in the summer. Now he was watching them die because strategic incompetence had overruled operational competence. And he was being ordered to organize a relief operation that everyone with military knowledge understood was nearly impossible. The encirclement at Stalingrad was more than a tactical defeat. It represented the complete failure of Germany's strategic approach to the Eastern War. The divided objectives Hitler had imposed in July, capture both Stalingrad and the Caucasus simultaneously, had dispersed German forces exactly as Hoth and other commanders had warned. The fixation on urban combat in Stalingrad had consumed German strength while Soviet forces prepared their counterstroke. The replacement of professional military judgment with ideological will had led to decisions, like the stand-fast order preventing breakout, that transformed a serious defeat into a catastrophe. And the institutional unwillingness to accept reality, Göring's impossible supply promises, Hitler's denial of the encirclement's significance, was condemning hundreds of thousands of soldiers to death or captivity. Operation Uranus had succeeded not because Soviet forces were overwhelmingly superior, but because German operational and strategic leadership had created the conditions for their own defeat. Hermann Hoth had learned in the 1930s how to execute perfect armored operations. He was learning in late 1942 that perfect execution means nothing when strategy is fundamentally flawed. December 12, 1942. Kotelnikovo, 100 miles southwest of Stalingrad. Oberst Hyacinth Graf Strachwitz, commander of a battle group in the 6th Panzer Division, climbs into his Panzer IV at dawn. Behind him, 230 tanks of 4th Panzer Army's relief force are starting their engines in the frozen darkness. Inside the Stalingrad pocket, 290,000 German soldiers are starving, freezing, and dying. They've been trapped for 3 weeks. Luftwaffe supply flights are delivering less than 1/3 of required supplies. Soldiers are eating their horses. The wounded are dying for lack of medical care. This relief force, Operation Winter Storm, is their only hope. Strachwitz knows the mathematics are terrible. His force is outnumbered 4-1 by Soviet defenders. They must advance 100 miles through prepared Soviet defensive positions in the depths of winter. Then the trapped forces must break out to meet them, which Hitler has forbidden. But the attack order has been given. At 0600 hours, German artillery opens fire, and the tanks roll forward. For 12 days, Winter Storm will represent Germany's last chance to demonstrate that armored warfare can still achieve decisive results. Its failure will mark the end of German offensive capability in the East. The relief force that Hermann Hoth assembled for Winter Storm represented everything 4th Panzer Army could scrape together. The 6th Panzer Division and 23rd Panzer Division formed the Armored Corps, 230 operational tanks between them. The 17th Panzer Division would join later if it could be extracted from defensive positions. Supporting infantry from the 15th Luftwaffe, Field Division, and various smaller units brought total strength to approximately 30,000 men. This was a fraction of 4th Panzer Army's summer strength, but it was all that remained available. The rest of 4th Panzer Army was either trapped in Stalingrad, scattered in defensive positions across southern Russia, or destroyed in the November battles. Hoth personally briefed division commanders on December 11th. His message was direct: break through to Stalingrad, establish a corridor, and enable the pocket to be supplied by ground transport. He did not mention breakout because Hitler had specifically forbidden 6th Army from attempting to escape. The mission was to relieve, not evacuate. The opening days of Winter Storm achieved surprising success against expectations. Strachwitz's battle group smashed through initial Soviet defensive lines on December 12th, advancing 12 miles the first day. Soviet forces, surprised by the attack's timing and strength, fell back to secondary positions. On December 13th, German forces advanced another 8 miles. By December 15th, the relief force had covered 35 miles and reached Verkhnechumsky, within 35 miles of the Stalingrad pocket's perimeter. This was the closest any relief force would ever come. Radio communications were established with units inside the pocket. Soldiers trapped in Stalingrad could hear the distant rumble of artillery from the relief battle. For a brief moment, salvation seemed possible. Inside the pocket, tank crews hoarded their last fuel, hoping for breakout orders. Infantry formed up in attack positions facing southwest, the direction from which relief was approaching. All they needed was permission to attack toward Hoth's forces. That permission never came. On December 19th, Adolf Hitler held a conference with Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, commander of Army Group Dawn, which included 4th Panzer Army. Manstein recommended that 6th Army should break out toward the relief force immediately. The gap was only 35 miles. If both forces attacked toward each other, they could link up. Once linked, the pocket could be supplied by ground convoy and potentially evacuated if the situation deteriorated further. Hitler refused. 6th Army would hold Stalingrad. The relief force would advance the final 35 miles alone and establish a supply corridor. There would be no retreat from the city. Manstein's chief of staff later wrote, "We had achieved the impossible, bringing a relief force within striking distance despite overwhelming odds. Now we were being ordered to achieve the truly impossible, advancing the final distance against an enemy that had reinforced massively, while 6th Army remained passive inside the pocket. The Soviet response to Winter Storm demonstrated how completely Red Army operational capabilities had evolved. On December 19th, as German relief forces paused at Verkhnechumsky to await resupply and reinforcements, Soviet Second Guards Army, held in reserve specifically for this contingency, launched a massive counterattack. Fresh Soviet formations with 320 tanks struck the relief forces' flanks. The Germans found themselves fighting off attacks from three sides simultaneously, while trying to advance towards Stalingrad. Combat devolved into desperate defensive battles. The 6th Panzer Division, which had led the advance, was pushed onto the defensive fighting to hold ground rather than gain it. Soviet artillery pounded German positions. Soviet aircraft attacked supply convoys. The temperature dropped to minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Tank engines froze overnight and required hours of warming fires to restart. Frostbite casualties exceeded combat casualties in some units. By December 21st, Winter Storm had stalled. German forces had advanced 35 miles but could advance no further. Soviet reinforcements were arriving faster than German forces could destroy them. Every mile gained had cost tanks, soldiers, and supplies that couldn't be replaced. The relief force had started with 230 tanks. Current strength reports showed 127 operational vehicles. Infantry battalions were down to half strength. Ammunition was running low. Artillery batteries were rationed to 20 shells per gun per day. Fuel supplies were critical, and 35 miles away, the Stalingrad pocket was slowly dying. Daily Luftwaffe supply deliveries were averaging 70 tons. Enough to sustain the pocket for perhaps another week before starvation and ammunition's exhaustion forced surrender. The trapped soldiers could see signal flares from Hoth's forces on clear nights. They were tantalizingly close, but they might as well have been on the moon. The decision to retreat was forced not by combat failure, but by strategic catastrophe elsewhere. On December 24th, Soviet forces launched Operation Little Saturn, a massive offensive against Italian 8th Army positions on the Don River, 200 miles northwest of Stalingrad. The Italian divisions, and equipped with inadequate weapons and stretched across an impossibly wide front, collapsed within 48 hours. Soviet armored forces poured through gaps in the line, threatening to encircle not just the relief force, but all of Army Group Dawn. Hermann Hoth received orders on December 23rd to break off Winter Storm and retreat to defensive positions before Soviet forces cut off his escape route. The relief of Stalingrad was abandoned. The trapped soldiers would have to survive on Luftwaffe supply alone, supply that everyone knew was grossly inadequate. On December 24th, 4th Panzer Army began withdrawing from Verkhnechumsky. The closest they came to Stalingrad was 35 miles. The distance might as well have been 300. The retreat from Verkhnechumsky mirrored the advance, but in reverse and under worse conditions. Soviet forces pursued aggressively, attacking German rearguards and attempting to cut off retreating columns. Tank battles erupted as German forces tried to break contact. The 23rd Panzer Division lost 42 tanks in 3 days, not to superior Soviet tactics, but to mechanical breakdown, fuel exhaustion, and being abandoned when recovery was impossible. Wounded soldiers were evacuated in unheated trucks across frozen steppe. Many died of exposure before reaching field hospitals. The withdrawal consumed the final reserves of equipment and morale that had sustained 4th Panzer Army through summer victories and autumn disasters. By December 28th, German forces had retreated 60 miles and were establishing defensive positions near Kotelnikovo. Winter Storm had advanced 35 miles in 7 days and retreated 60 miles in 5 days. The net result was loss of territory and destruction of Germany's last mobile reserve in southern Russia. The human experience of Winter Storm appears in countless personal accounts that capture the desperation of the attempt and the tragedy of its failure. Lieutenant Heinrich Gerlach, trapped inside the Stalingrad pocket, wrote in his diary, December 19th, we heard the relief force is 35 kilometers away. Officers are preparing for breakout. Men are hoarding ammunition. December 21st. Relief force has stopped. No breakout orders received. December 23rd. Relief force is retreating. We are alone. It's December 25th. Christmas in hell. No supplies arrived today. We ate the last horse yesterday. Men are dying of hunger and cold. That final entry, men dying of hunger and cold, would describe the Stalingrad pocket for the next 6 weeks as the trapped army slowly disintegrated. Outside the pocket, soldiers who had fought to within 35 miles of rescuing their comrades experienced a different trauma, the knowledge that they had come so close and failed. The casualties from Winter Storm were devastating relative to the forces committed. 4th Panzer Army suffered approximately 16,000 casualties, killed, wounded, and missing, in 12 days of combat. This represented more than half the force committed to the operation. Tank losses exceeded 100 vehicles. Artillery losses included dozens of guns abandoned during the retreat. But the strategic consequences were far worse than the tactical losses. Germany had committed its last operational reserve in southern Russia to relieving Stalingrad and failed. No further relief attempts were possible. The Stalingrad pocket was doomed. Every soldier and officer involved knew it. But Adolf Hitler's stand-fast order remained in effect. The trapped forces would hold their positions until they could fight no more. Supply by air continued at inadequate levels, and slowly, methodically, the Soviet forces tightened their grip on the pocket. Hermann Hoth's December 29th. Report to Army Group Don headquarters summarized Winter Storm's results with professional precision that barely concealed personal anguish. Relief operation failed. Advance of 35 miles achieved against heavy resistance. Final approach to pocket prevented by enemy reinforcement and deteriorating situation on Army Group's northern flank. Forced to withdraw to prevent encirclement of relief force. Current 4th Panzer Army. Strength inadequate for renewed relief attempt. 6th Army inside pocket cannot be reached with available forces. Between those clinical lines lay the human reality. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were going to die because strategic incompetence had created an impossible situation and ideological rigidity prevented accepting the only rational solution: evacuation. Hoth had spent 12 years learning how to execute perfect armored operations. Winter Storm had been executed as well as possible given impossible constraints. But perfect execution of an impossible mission still equals failure. And failure at Stalingrad meant not just defeat, but catastrophe from which the Wehrmacht would never recover. January 15th, 1943. Rostov-on-Don, gateway to the Caucasus. Major Wilhelm Schaefer, the quartermaster who had calculated fuel deficits in autumn 1941, is now calculating retreat routes. 4th Panzer Army is withdrawing westward across Ukraine, conducting a fighting retreat across 300 miles of frozen steppe. Soviet forces are pursuing everywhere. Schaefer's maps show unit positions, supply dumps, river crossings, and rail junctions. But the maps are outdated within hours. Units marked in one position have already fallen back 20 miles. Supply dumps marked for evacuation have been overrun. Every calculation is obsolete before completion. Schaefer is trying to organize logistics for an army that is simultaneously fighting, retreating, and disintegrating. Radio reports come in constantly. 4th Panzer Army elements near Kamensk, Shakhtinsky are withdrawing under pressure. Supply convoy destroyed by Soviet air attack near Novocherkassk. Bridge demolitions completed at Bataisk. The war that began with victorious advances into infinite Russian space is now retreat through the same space. And behind them, still trapped in Stalingrad, 290,000 German soldiers are entering their final weeks of existence. The retreat from the Caucasus and southern Russia was militarily necessary but strategically devastating. Soviet offensives in late December and early January had shattered the defensive lines protecting Germany's southern conquests. 1st Panzer Army, which had advanced deep into the Caucasus toward the oil fields, was in danger of being cut off. Army Group Don, which included 4th Panzer Army, faced encirclement if it remained in current positions. Adolf Hitler finally authorized withdrawals on January 6th, not from strategic wisdom, but because the alternative was losing entire army groups. The retreat was conducted under winter conditions that made the previous year's suffering seem mild by comparison. Temperatures routinely hit 30 below zero. Soldiers wrapped themselves in whatever they could find: blankets, captured Soviet coats, newspapers stuffed inside jackets. Vehicles broke down constantly. Roads were sheets of ice or rivers of mud depending on the temperature. And Soviet forces pursued relentlessly, attacking whenever German units paused. The withdrawal transformed 4th Panzer Army from an offensive formation into something resembling a mobile defensive task force. Hermann Hoth pioneered what German doctrine would later call mobile defense, using armor not to attack but to counterattack Soviet breakthroughs, stabilize collapsing sectors, and cover the retreat of slower-moving infantry. The technique required constant movement and perfect timing. Soviet forces would break through a defensive line. 4th Panzer Army's panzers would rush to the breakthrough point, attack the Soviet penetration from the flank, destroy or push back the attacking forces, and establish a temporary defensive line. This would buy time for German infantry to withdraw to the next defensive position. Then 4th Panzer Army would disengage and leapfrog backward to defend the next critical point. It was exhausting, dangerous, and ultimately futile, trading space for time when Germany had no time left to buy, and space was all it was losing. The successful backhand blow at Krasnograd in mid-February demonstrated that German operational competence remained high even in retreat. Soviet forces had broken through German lines north of Krasnograd and were driving westward to encircle retreating German units. Hoth identified the Soviet penetration as an opportunity rather than a crisis. The Soviet tank corps had advanced rapidly but had exposed its flanks. On February 18th, and 4th Panzer Army's remaining panzer divisions, 3rd and 11th, attacked the Soviet penetration from both flanks simultaneously. The counterattack caught Soviet forces by surprise. In 3 days of fighting, German forces destroyed approximately 300 Soviet tanks and eliminated 2 Soviet tank corps as effective fighting formations. The victory demonstrated what German armor could still achieve, but at unsustainable cost. 4th Panzer Army lost 89 tanks at Krasnograd, reducing operational strength to barely 100 vehicles. The tactical victory bought perhaps 2 weeks of breathing space. Then the retreat continued. The recapture of Kharkov in March represented Field Marshal Erich von Manstein's masterpiece of mobile defense and 4th Panzer Army's supporting role in the operation. Soviet forces had captured Kharkov on February 16th, as German forces retreated westward, but Soviet units were overextended, having advanced faster than their supply lines could sustain. Manstein assembled scattered German units, including 4th Panzer Army elements, and counterattacked in early March. The operation recaptured Kharkov by March 15th and temporarily stabilized the southern front. German newsreels presented it as a great victory. Tactically, it was impressive. German forces had stopped a Soviet offensive, conducted a successful counteroffensive, and recaptured a major city. But strategically, it merely postponed inevitable defeat. 4th Panzer Army entered the Kharkov counterstroke with 240 tanks. It finished with 189 operational vehicles. The arithmetic was simple and fatal. Every engagement reduced German strength faster than replacements arrived. The casualty statistics from the winter retreat tell a story of armies destroying each other through attrition. From January through March 1943, 4th Panzer Army suffered approximately 43,000 casualties, killed, wounded, and missing. Soviet forces pursuing the retreat lost an estimated 95,000 casualties in the same period. By arithmetic, Germany was winning the exchange, inflicting 2 casualties for everyone suffered, but Soviet losses were sustainable. Factories in the Urals were producing 500 tanks per month. Manpower reserves from Central Asia and Siberia provided endless replacements. The Red Army could afford to lose 95,000 soldiers and remain combat effective. Germany could not afford to lose 43,000 and continue offensive operations. Every casualty was irreplaceable. Every destroyed tank meant 1 less vehicle available for future operations. The war was becoming a mathematics problem that Germany could not solve. The spring Rasputitsa, the mud season when melting snow turned roads into impassable swamps, forced an operational pause in late March. Both sides had fought continuously for 4 months across hundreds of miles. Both were exhausted. The Rasputitsa made large-scale movement impossible, forcing a temporary cessation of major operations. For 4th Panzer Army, the pause offered a desperately needed opportunity to rest, refit, and absorb replacements. But the replacements were inadequate. Infantry divisions that should have had 17,000 men numbered 9,000. Tank battalions authorized for 88 tanks fielded 42. Artillery batteries were short of guns, ammunition, and prime movers. The German army fighting in Russia in spring 1943 bore little resemblance to the magnificent force that had crossed the border 22 months earlier. It remained professionally competent and capable of tactical brilliance, but it was smaller, weaker, more fragmented, and facing an enemy that grew stronger every month. The fate of the Stalingrad pocket, which finally surrendered on February 2nd after weeks of starvation and hopeless resistance, cast a long shadow over 4th Panzer Army. 91,000 German soldiers marched into Soviet captivity at Stalingrad. Only 6,000 would survive to return to Germany after the war. The Stalingrad disaster cost Germany an entire field army and half of 4th Panzer Army's strength, but the material losses paled compared to the psychological impact. Stalingrad proved German forces could be not just defeated, but annihilated. It demonstrated that Soviet industrial capacity exceeded German capacity to inflict damage. Most devastatingly, it showed that ideological rigidity and strategic incompetence at the highest levels could negate tactical excellence at lower levels. Hermann Hoth had commanded half of 4th Panzer Army into the Stalingrad catastrophe, attempted relief, failed, and then withdrawn the survivors westward. The weight of that sequence appears in his March correspondence with subordinate commanders, clinical discussions of tactics and logistics that avoid any mention of the strategic disaster they were living through. Field Marshal von Manstein's after-action report on the winter campaign included substantial praise for Hermann Hoth's operational performance. Manstein credited Hoth's operational artistry with preventing the complete collapse of Army Group Dawn's southern wing. The mobile defense tactics Hoth pioneered would become standard German doctrine for the war's remainder. His ability to extract 4th Panzer Army from impossible situations while maintaining unit cohesion was remarkable. But Manstein's praise highlighted a tragic irony. German commanders were becoming masters of losing slowly. They could conduct brilliant tactical operations, execute complex maneuvers, and demonstrate professional excellence. But every operation was defensive or limited objective. None offered prospect of strategic victory. The question hanging unspoken was whether excellence in defensive operations was worth anything when Germany needed offensive victories to win the war. By March 23, 1943, when the spring thaw brought large-scale operations to a temporary halt, 4th Panzer Army had retreated 340 miles from its positions at the start of the Soviet winter offensive. It had fought dozens of engagements, conducted several successful counterattacks, and maintained organizational coherence despite continuous combat. But coherence was relative, and tank strength stood at 189 operational vehicles, less than 20% of the 1,100 tanks the Army had fielded 9 months earlier. Infantry divisions were skeletons of their authorized strength. Artillery was worn out from continuous firing. Supply dumps were depleted. Morale was declining. And waiting across the front line was a Red Army that had grown from strength to strength, that was absorbing lessons from every engagement, that possessed material superiority and operational initiative. Hermann Hoth had learned mobile defense through necessity. But defense doesn't win wars, and 4th Panzer Army's next offensive, the Battle of Kursk, would demonstrate definitively that German armored forces had lost the ability to achieve decisive offensive results against Soviet opposition. The long retreat from Stalingrad and the Caucasus was ending. What came next would be worse. April 8, 1943, Kharkov Airfield. Luftwaffe reconnaissance photographs are being developed in a mobile photo laboratory. Lieutenant Franz Weber, an intelligence officer assigned to 4th Panzer Army headquarters, examines the images through a magnifying glass. The photographs show the Kursk salient, a bulge in the Soviet lines approximately 100 miles wide and 70 miles deep that protrudes westward into German-held territory. Weber is counting defensive positions. First defensive belt, continuous trenches, anti-tank ditches, minefields. Second defensive belt, 5 miles behind the first, equally fortified. Third belt, fourth belt, fifth belt, sixth belt. The fortifications extend over 100 miles deep. Weber calculates mine density, approximately 400,000 anti-tank and anti-personnel mines based on disturbed earth patterns. The photographs are dated April 6th. New photographs from April 8th show additional fortifications in the same areas. The Soviets are fortifying Kursk every day, and Wehrmacht planning staffs are still debating whether to attack there. Weber writes in his report, "Enemy defensive preparations extensive and expanding daily. Any attack will face unprecedented fortification density. Recommend earliest possible attack date or cancellation of operation." His report goes up the chain of command. The operation is not canceled, it is delayed, and with every day of delay, the Kursk defenses grow stronger. The Kursk salient existed because of the successful German counteroffensive at Kharkov in March. As Soviet forces had created a bulge in their lines driving westward toward the Dnieper River. When German forces counterattacked and recaptured Kharkov, the bulge remained, a salient that offered tempting operational possibilities. German planners saw an opportunity to execute a classic double envelopment, attack from north and south simultaneously, link up behind Soviet forces, encircle and destroy them. The operation was codenamed Citadel. On paper, it looked achievable. Army Group South, including 4th Panzer Army, would attack from the south. Army Group Center would attack from the north. The two forces would meet east of Kursk, trapping Soviet forces in a pocket. Destroy those forces, and Germany might regain operational initiative. Fail, and Germany would have squandered its last defensive capability on a doomed operation. And Adolf Hitler's decision to delay Operation Citadel from May to July proved catastrophic, but was driven by understandable logic. New German tanks were entering production, the Panther medium tank and the Tiger heavy tank. The Panther mounted an excellent long-barreled 75mm gun and had 80mm of frontal armor. The Tiger carried the legendary 88mm gun and had 100mm of frontal armor. These tanks could destroy any Soviet tank at ranges where Soviet guns were ineffective. Hitler believed that waiting for sufficient Panthers and Tigers would guarantee victory. What he failed to calculate was that Soviet intelligence knew everything about German plans. On May 4th, the Lucy spy ring, Soviet intelligence sources in Switzerland with access to Wehrmacht planning, delivered complete details of Operation Citadel to Moscow. The Soviets knew when, where, and with what forces Germany would attack. They used the delay to prepare the most formidable defensive system ever constructed. The defensive fortifications the Soviets constructed around Kursk dwarfed anything the Wehrmacht had encountered. Red Army engineers worked frantically from April through June, building 6 successive defensive belts extending 100 miles deep. Each belt consisted of continuous trench lines, anti-tank ditches up to 15 feet deep, machine gun bunkers, artillery positions, and dense minefields. And the Soviets laid approximately 930,000 anti-tank mines and approximately 660,000 anti-personnel mines around Kursk. That's roughly 40 mines per mile of front, meaning a German tank advancing 1 mile would likely strike 40 mines. Soviet commanders positioned anti-tank guns in depth with overlapping fields of fire. Tank reserves were positioned behind defensive lines to counterattack any German breakthrough. The entire defensive system was designed on the assumption that German forces would attack and could be defeated through prepared defense in depth. 4th Panzer Army received 200 new tanks in May and June, including 90 Panthers and 42 Tigers. Tank crews trained on the new vehicles and were initially impressed. The Panther's gun could penetrate 140 millimeters of armor at 1,000 meters, more than enough to destroy any Soviet tank. The Tiger was nearly invulnerable frontally. Its armor could withstand Soviet 76mm guns, except at very close range. But the new tanks had severe mechanical problems. Panthers suffered transmission failures and final drive breakdowns. Engine fires were common. The Panther's gasoline engine was positioned in the rear compartment with inadequate fire suppression. In training, 60% of Panthers broke down before completing 50 miles of driving. Crews nicknamed them rolling coffins because hits to the rear often caused catastrophic fires. The Tigers were more reliable, but consumed enormous amounts of fuel and were too heavy for many bridges. And German planners assumed technological superiority would overcome numerical disadvantage. They didn't account for mechanical unreliability. The intelligence assessments available to 4th Panzer Army by late June painted a clear picture of what they faced. Galen Org, the Wehrmacht's intelligence service for the Eastern Front, produced detailed estimates of Soviet defensive strength around Kursk. The reports were remarkably accurate. Approximately 1,300,000 Soviet soldiers defending the salient, 1,700 tanks in first-line defensive positions, with another 1,500 in reserve, 20,000 artillery pieces and mortars, 3,000 aircraft. Against this, 4th Panzer Army would attack with approximately 160,000 soldiers, 1,100 tanks, and 700 aircraft. The arithmetic was unfavorable. German attackers outnumbered in infantry, outnumbered in armor, outnumbered in artillery, attacking into prepared defenses that would negate mobility advantages. Multiple staff officers raised concerns. The concerns were noted and dismissed. The attack would proceed. The final briefing before Citadel occurred on July 4th at 4th Panzer Army headquarters. Hermann Hoth reviewed objectives with division commanders. 4th Panzer Army would attack northward from positions south of Belgorod. The initial objective was to penetrate Soviet defensive lines, advance approximately 50 miles, and link with 9th Army attacking from the north. This would encircle Soviet forces in the salient. Hoth's briefing was professional and detailed. He outlined each division's route, objectives, and support. But several officers later recalled that Hoth seemed to lack the confidence that had characterized his pre-battle briefings in previous campaigns. He emphasized careful coordination, consolidation of gains, and avoiding overextension. He did not discuss exploitation or pursuit, the hallmarks of successful blitzkrieg. The briefing felt defensive. It was planning an offensive operation with defensive caution because everyone involved understood the risks. Germany was committing its last operational reserve to an attack everyone knew the Soviets were expecting. The material buildup for Citadel represented Germany's maximum effort. Supply dumps around Belgorod held sufficient fuel for 2 weeks of offensive operations. Ammunition allocations included millions of artillery shells. Medical facilities were expanded to handle anticipated casualties. Tank repair facilities were positioned to recover damaged vehicles quickly. Replacement crews were trained and ready. Everything possible had been done to ensure success. But all the preparation couldn't change fundamental realities. Germany was attacking into a defensive system specifically designed to defeat this attack. Soviet reserves outnumbered German attacking forces. German tank strength included many Panthers that would break down mechanically before engaging the enemy. And most critically, Germany had no strategic reserve. If Citadel failed, there would be no forces available to conduct another offensive. This was the last throw of the dice. In individual soldiers' letters and diaries from late June and early July reveal widespread awareness that something decisive was approaching. Corporal Hans Schmidt, assigned to the Großdeutschland division attached to 4th Panzer Army, wrote to his wife, July 2nd, "We've been preparing for weeks. New tanks, new equipment, enormous stockpiles. The officers say this will be the decisive battle of the war. We attack soon. I don't know what to think. Last year we attacked and won battles but lost the war. This year we're attacking into positions the Russians have been building for months. They know we're coming. How do you surprise an enemy that's waiting for you? But orders are orders. We'll attack. We'll do our duty. God willing, I'll write again from the other side of this battle." Schmidt was killed on July 7th, 3 days into the offensive. His last letter arrived in Germany 2 weeks after his death. On July 4th, 1943, the pieces were in position for the largest armored battle in history. 4th Panzer Army, with 1,100 tanks, was ready to attack from the south. 9th Army, with over 900 tanks, was ready to attack from the north. Between them, lay the Kursk salient, defended by over 3 million Soviet soldiers in multiple army groups, 3,300 tanks, and defensive fortifications of unprecedented density. The outcome would determine whether Germany could still win defensive victories in the east, or whether Soviet material and operational superiority had become insurmountable. A Hermann Hoth had commanded 4th Panzer Army for 13 months. He had led brilliant advances and desperate retreats. He had won tactical victories and suffered strategic defeats. Now, he was about to lead an offensive he knew was probably doomed, but might represent Germany's last hope. At 0300 hours on July 5th, German artillery would open fire, and the Battle of Kursk would begin. Everything 4th Panzer Army had done for the past year had led to this moment, and what happened in the next 2 weeks would determine everything that followed. July 5th, 1943. 0300 hours. Southern edge of the Kursk salient. Unteroffizier Paul Schaefer sits in his Panther tank, waiting for the artillery barrage to begin. Around him in the darkness, over 1,000 German tanks are positioned in assembly areas. The plan calls for a brief artillery preparation, and then the armor attacks at dawn. The Germans are hoping for surprise, despite everyone knowing the Soviets are expecting this offensive. At 0315, German artillery opens fire, but before the first German shells land, Soviet artillery responds. The Soviets aren't just ready. They're conducting a preemptive bombardment based on exact knowledge of German assembly areas. Shells rain down on concentrations of German tanks. The surprise is reversed. The Soviets are bombarding German forces before the German attack even begins. Schaefer's Panther is hit by shell fragments that damage its track. Crews scramble to repair damage before the attack starts. At 0500 hours, despite the Soviet bombardment, 4th Panzer Army begins advancing. Panthers and Tigers lead, followed by Panzer IVs and infantry. Immediately, as they hit the first minefield, the first day of Citadel has begun. It will take 4th Panzer Army 8 days to advance 25 miles through defenses that extend 100 miles deep. The mathematics of the offensive are already impossible. The first day's combat revealed how thoroughly Soviet defensive doctrine had evolved to counter German armored tactics. 4th Panzer Army attacked with 2nd SS Panzer Corps and 48th Panzer Corps, approximately 700 tanks advancing on a 30-mile front. They immediately encountered minefields denser than anything previously experienced. Soviet engineers had created what they called pack fronts, anti-tank gun fronts, with overlapping fields of fire covering the minefields. German tanks that stopped to navigate mines came under fire from concealed anti-tank guns. These tanks that accelerated through the minefields struck mines and were disabled. The Panthers, which were supposed to lead the breakthrough with their superior armor and guns, suffered catastrophic mechanical failures. Of 90 Panthers that began the attack, 56 were disabled by mechanical breakdown within the first 6 hours, not from enemy fire, but from transmission failures, engine problems, and track breaks. The advance that was supposed to achieve 20 miles on the first day gained 4 miles at the cost of 114 tanks. The second and third days of Citadel ground down German strength through attrition that favored defenders. Soviet defensive doctrine called for forward positions to delay but not stop German attacks. If Soviet forces would retreat from first defensive lines to second lines after inflicting casualties. This forced Germans to assault multiple defensive belts consecutively, suffering losses at each belt. The tactic worked perfectly. 4th Panzer Army penetrated the first defensive belt on July 6th after heavy fighting. The second belt was 5 miles behind it. Attacking the second belt required exposing tanks and infantry to Soviet artillery fire while crossing open ground. By July 7th, 4th Panzer Army had reached the second defensive belt, but had lost 200 tanks, nearly 20% of starting strength. The advance was occurring, but at rates and costs that made reaching the final objective mathematically impossible. The German planners had allocated 2 weeks of supplies for an operation they expected to complete in 1 week. By day 3, they were already behind schedule and over casualty projections. The Soviet tactical evolution was visible in every engagement. Red Army tank commanders no longer advanced across open ground to engage German panzers in mobile combat, where German superiority in optics, radios, and crew training provided advantages. Instead, Soviet tanks operated from prepared positions, firing from hull-down positions where only their turrets were exposed. Soviet anti-tank guns were positioned in depth with interlocking fields of fire. When German tanks destroyed one position, fire came from other positions they hadn't identified. Soviet infantry used anti-tank rifles at close range to disable German tanks' tracks and optics, and immobilizing them for destruction by heavier weapons. The Soviets had learned from 2 years of defeats. They weren't fighting German-style mobile warfare. They were fighting Soviet-style defensive warfare, optimized to bleed German attacks to death through attrition. The technological promise of Panthers and Tigers proved largely hollow in practice. The Panthers continued suffering mechanical failures throughout the battle. Tank crews spent more time repairing their vehicles than fighting with them. The few Panthers that remained operational did perform well in combat. Their guns could destroy Soviet tanks at long range. But mechanical unreliability meant only 20 to 30 Panthers were operational at any given time out of 90 committed. Yes, Tigers performed better mechanically, but their extreme weight made them vulnerable to being bogged down in soft ground. Several Tigers sank into mud and had to be abandoned when they couldn't be recovered. The technological edge that was supposed to compensate for numerical inferiority didn't materialize because the technology wasn't reliable enough for sustained combat operations. German tank crews found themselves fighting with Panzer IVs, reliable but outgunned, against Soviet T-34s that were less sophisticated individually but present in overwhelming numbers. By July 9th, 4th Panzer Army had advanced 18 miles and was approaching Prokhorovka, a small town that would become the site of the largest armored battle in history. Soviet intelligence identified Prokhorovka as the critical position. Even if 4th Panzer Army broke through there, they might actually achieve a breakthrough toward the link-up point with 9th Army. Marshal Zhukov committed 5th Guards Tank Army, 450 tanks held in strategic reserve, to stop the German advance at Prokhorovka. Meanwhile, 4th Panzer Army had been reinforced with additional units, bringing strength to approximately 600 operational tanks. Both sides were committing everything to this engagement. The battle would occur on July 12th on relatively open ground, the kind of terrain where armored combat traditionally favored the side with better tanks and crews. This would be the test. Could German tactical and technological superiority overcome Soviet numerical superiority in a direct armored clash? The Battle of Prokhorovka on July 12, 1943, involved approximately 840 German tanks, engaging approximately 850 Soviet tanks. Nearly 1,700 armored vehicles in combat simultaneously. The battle began at dawn, with Soviet tanks attacking German positions en masse. Soviet doctrine for Prokhorovka was simple: close to point-blank range where German technological advantages disappeared. Soviet T-34s and T-70 light tanks charged German lines at maximum speed. Many were destroyed at long range by German guns, but enough reached close range that German tanks found themselves in point-blank melees where superior German optics and radios didn't matter. Tank commanders couldn't coordinate when Soviet tanks were ramming German tanks or firing from 10 meters away. The battle devolved into chaos: burning tanks, explosions, and crews bailing out of destroyed vehicles, hand-to-hand combat between tank crews. By nightfall, the battlefield was littered with destroyed tanks from both sides. The casualty exchange at Prokhorovka favored Germany numerically, but defeated Germany strategically. Soviet forces lost approximately 650 tanks, destroyed or disabled. German forces lost approximately 350 tanks. By arithmetic, Germany won, inflicting nearly 2-to-1 casualties. But Germany started with fewer tanks and couldn't replace losses. The Soviets could replace their losses. Soviet factories would deliver 500 new tanks to 5th Guards Tank Army within the next week. German tank production was running at approximately 75 tanks per week for the entire Eastern Front. OE 4th Panzer Army would not receive 500 replacement tanks in the next month, let alone the next week. Prokhorovka proved that Germany could still win tactical engagements, but couldn't afford the cost of winning. Every tank lost was irreplaceable. Every casualty reduced future offensive capability. Winning battles while losing the production war was a formula for ultimate defeat. On July 13th, Adolf Hitler canceled Operation Citadel. The decision was driven by events elsewhere. Anglo-American forces had invaded Sicily on July 10th, and Hitler wanted to transfer units to Italy. But the operational reality was that Citadel had already failed. 4th Panzer Army had advanced 25 miles in 8 days, at the cost of approximately 400 tanks and 30,000 casualties. They had penetrated 4 of the 6 defensive belts, but were still 75 miles from the link-up point with 9th Army. Soviet reserves were still arriving. Defensive positions ahead remained intact. The offensive had achieved nothing decisive and consumed Germany's last operational reserves. The plan to encircle and destroy Soviet forces at Kursk had failed completely. Instead, Germany had conducted a week of extraordinarily expensive attacks that demonstrated the Wehrmacht could no longer achieve operational breakthroughs against prepared Soviet defenses. Individual German soldiers' accounts from the final days of Citadel capture the psychological impact of the failed offensive. Lieutenant Heinrich Eberbach of the 3rd Panzer Division wrote, "July 13th, we've been attacking for 9 days. In every day we advance a few kilometers. Every day we lose tanks we can't replace. The Russians keep appearing. More tanks, more infantry, more artillery. Where do they all come from? We were told this would be decisive. We were told we'd break through. All we've done is break ourselves." The order came today to halt the offensive. Some men seemed relieved. Others seemed broken. We came so far. We fought so hard, and we achieved nothing. That assessment, "we achieved nothing," was devastating but accurate. Citadel had consumed 4th Panzer Army's offensive capability without achieving any strategic objective. Germany had lost its last chance to regain initiative in the east. From this moment forward, everything would be retreat, defense, and slow defeat. August 17th, 1943. 4th Panzer Army Headquarters. The hastily relocated 200 miles south of Kursk. Chief of Staff Colonel Werner von Fritsch is coordinating crisis responses across multiple sectors simultaneously. Radio reports flood in. Soviet offensive at Belgorod has broken through 8th Army positions. Soviet offensive at Kharkov threatens encirclement of 3 German divisions. Soviet offensive near the Mayos River is pushing back 6th Army. Each crisis demands immediate response. Each response requires shifting 4th Panzer Army units laterally instead of forward. Von Fritsch marks unit positions on the map with colored pins. 3rd Panzer Division moving south to block Belgorod breakthrough. 11th Panzer Division moving east to stabilize Kharkov sector. 23rd. Panzer Division moving west to cover Mayos River. The pins trace zigzag patterns across Ukraine, constant movement that accomplishes nothing except consuming fuel and wearing out equipment. This is what 4th Panzer Army has become, a fire brigade rushed from crisis to crisis, never concentrated enough to achieve decisive results, perpetually reacting to Soviet initiatives. The map tells a story of strategic collapse. Every Soviet offensive creates a crisis. Every crisis requires 4th Panzer Army's intervention. And, with each intervention, the army fragments further into isolated battle groups incapable of mutual support. The fundamental misuse of armored forces was apparent to every professional officer watching 4th Panzer Army's employment in late summer 1943. Hermann Hoth had spent his entire career advocating for concentration of armored forces to achieve breakthrough and exploitation. Now, his army was being dispersed across a 200-mile front, divided into regimental and battalion-sized battle groups sent wherever Soviet breakthroughs seemed most dangerous. This violated every principle of armored warfare. Tanks operating in small groups lost their mass and momentum. They became mobile pillboxes rather than exploitation forces. The dispersion made logistics nightmares worse. Supply convoys had to reach dozens of scattered units instead of concentrated formations. It made maintenance impossible. Repair facilities couldn't support units spread across hundreds of miles. Most devastatingly, it surrendered operational initiative permanently to the Soviets. That its 4th Panzer Army could only react to Soviet offensives, never conduct offensive operations of its own. The loss of Kharkov on August 23rd symbolized Germany's deteriorating position in Ukraine. 4th Panzer Army had helped recapture Kharkov in March with Manstein's brilliant counterstroke. Now, 5 months later, Soviet forces retook the city after 4th Panzer Army was pulled away to respond to crises elsewhere. The city changed hands without 4th Panzer Army even participating in its defense. The forces that might have held Kharkov were dispersed across southern Ukraine, fighting separate battles. Hoth's headquarters received the evacuation order and organized rearguard actions to cover the withdrawal. German engineers demolished industrial facilities, railway junctions, and bridges. The civilians fled westward ahead of advancing Soviet forces. The retreat was conducted professionally and avoided encirclement. But the loss of Kharkov, Ukraine's second-largest city and a major industrial center, demonstrated that Germany could no longer hold strategically important positions. Territory was being traded for time, and time was running out. The operational tempo of retreat consumed 4th Panzer Army faster than Soviet combat did. Units repositioned every few days, conducting movement under threat of Soviet air attack and artillery fire. The 23rd Panzer Division's war diary from September documents the exhaustion. September 3rd. Repositioned 60 kilometers west to Poltava sector. September 7th. Repositioned 80 kilometers south to Dnieper River line. Any September 12th. Repositioned 50 kilometers north to cover Kremenchug. September 16th. Repositioned 70 kilometers southwest to block Soviet breakthrough. Each repositioning consumed fuel, wore out vehicles, and exhausted crews. Tanks designed for combat operations were being driven hundreds of miles on roads between battle positions. Transmissions failed, engines wore out, track pins broke. By October, 45% of 4th Panzer Army's tanks were non-operational, not from combat damage, but from mechanical exhaustion. The army was literally driving itself to death, trying to respond to Soviet pressure everywhere simultaneously. The Dnieper River defensive line, which German planners hoped would stabilize the front, collapsed before it could be properly established. And now the Dnieper was a formidable natural obstacle, up to 3 kilometers wide in places, with steep banks. If German forces could establish a continuous defensive line along the Dnieper, they might halt Soviet advances and force a strategic pause. But establishing that line required time 4th Panzer Army didn't have. Units arrived at the Dnieper exhausted from continuous retreat. Engineers attempted to prepare defensive positions, but were rushed by pursuing Soviet forces. By late September, Soviet units had already crossed the Dnieper at multiple points using improvised rafts and boats. They established bridgeheads on the western bank before German forces could occupy defensive positions. 4th Panzer Army was sent to eliminate Soviet bridgeheads. But there were too many bridgeheads and too few German forces. The Dnieper line, which was supposed to be Germany's last defensible position in Ukraine, never functioned as a coherent defense. It was a series of isolated battles that Germany consistently lost. The personnel crisis became acute as experienced soldiers were killed or wounded without adequate replacement. 4th Panzer Army's infantry divisions received replacement drafts that barely covered 1/3 of casualties. The replacements were increasingly young, 16 and 17-year-old boys with minimal training, or old men in their 40s, pulled from rear area duties or exempted occupations. The 3rd Panzer Division's personnel officer reported in October that 52% of infantry replacements received had less than 8 weeks of training. They arrived at the front not knowing how to properly operate their weapons, how to read maps, or how to execute basic tactical movements. Experienced NCOs tried to train them during brief pauses in combat. Many died in their first engagement. The decline in personnel quality meant that even when 4th Panzer Army had adequate numbers on paper, combat effectiveness was severely degraded. The formation of stomach battalions illustrated the desperation of German personnel policy. These were infantry units composed of soldiers with digestive ailments who required special diets, men who would normally be medically discharged or assigned to rear area duties. Germany was so desperate for manpower that it was forming combat units for men with chronic gastric problems, equipping them with special rations, and sending them to the front. 4th Panzer Army received 2 stomach battalions in November. These units fought adequately in defensive positions, but lacked the physical stamina for mobile operations. They represented the absurd endpoint of total mobilization, an army scraping the absolute bottom of manpower reserves to maintain units in the field while calling them combat-effective formations. The stomach battalions became dark jokes among regular soldiers. If Germany was fielding units of men with ulcers, how much worse could things get? The December crisis near Kirovograd demonstrated 4th Panzer Army's operational fragmentation at its worst. Soviet forces broke through at Kirovograd, creating a 60-mile gap in German lines. 4th Panzer Army headquarters received orders to seal the breach, but 4th Panzer Army at that point existed more as a concept than a reality. All its subordinate divisions were scattered across 180 miles of front under 3 different corps headquarters, responding to separate crises. Assembling a concentrated force to counterattack at Kirovograd would require withdrawing units from their current positions, which would create new crises elsewhere. Hoth attempted to explain this to Army Group South. 4th Panzer Army couldn't be in 5 places simultaneously, but it was being ordered to do exactly that. The response was that Kirovograd must be held. The result was predictable. 4th Panzer Army sent what forces it could spare, 2 depleted panzer divisions, which conducted a limited counterattack, failed to eliminate the Soviet breakthrough, and retreated to avoid encirclement. The operation consumed resources without achieving objectives because the resources were inadequate for the mission assigned. By January 14, 1944, 4th Panzer Army had been fragmented into 3 separate battle groups operating under different commands across southern Ukraine. Army Group South's organizational chart showed 4th Panzer Army controlling 18 different divisions across 5 corps. In reality, this was a fiction. The divisions operated independently, receiving orders from local corps or army headquarters based on immediate tactical situations. 4th Panzer Army headquarters existed, but controlled nothing. Hermann Hoth spent his days receiving situation reports from units he couldn't effectively command because they were too dispersed, fighting separate battles, facing different enemies. And even this wasn't command. This was informed observation of disaster unfolding across hundreds of miles. The elegant instrument of armored warfare that Hoth had commanded in summer 1942 had been shattered into fragments incapable of coordinated action. The contrast with summer 1942 was devastating. 18 months earlier, 4th Panzer Army had advanced across the steppe with 1,100 tanks, conducting brilliant operational maneuvers, achieving breakthrough after breakthrough. Now, it numbered 210 operational tanks scattered across southern Ukraine in company and battalion-sized groups. 18 months earlier, it had fought offensive battles of maneuver, where German tactical superiority could dominate. Now, it fought desperate defensive battles, where numerical inferiority was decisive. And 18 months earlier, strategic objectives seemed achievable. Now the only objective was survival, preventing encirclement, conducting orderly retreats, buying time for a stabilization that never came. 4th Panzer Army hadn't been destroyed in a single catastrophic battle like 6th Army at Stalingrad. It had been ground down through attrition, fragmented through operational misuse, and degraded to the point where the name Panzer Army was nearly meaningless. Hermann Hoth's December memo to Field Marshal Manstein requesting consolidation of 4th Panzer Army's scattered forces went unanswered for 3 weeks. When a response finally came, it acknowledged the problem but offered no solution. All sectors were under pressure. Withdrawing units from any sector to consolidate forces elsewhere would create vulnerabilities the Soviets would exploit. 4th Panzer Army must continue operating as dispersed battle groups responding to immediate threats. There would be no concentration, no operational pause, no opportunity to rebuild as a cohesive formation. Hoth's memo had essentially requested permission to function as a proper armored army. The response denied that possibility. 4th Panzer Army would remain a collection of mobile fire brigades until circumstances changed or until it was destroyed. Given the trajectory of the war, destruction seemed more likely than improvement. The long defensive retreat was accelerating toward catastrophe, and the catastrophe would arrive at a place called Korsun-Cherkasy, and where 4th Panzer Army would replay the Stalingrad disaster in reverse, attempting relief from outside while German forces were encircled inside. The failure at Korsun would cost Hermann Hoth his command, and 4th Panzer Army what remained of its offensive capability. January 28, 1944. Inside the Korsun-Cherkasy pocket, Ukraine. Obergefreiter Martin Weber of the 57th Infantry Division watches Soviet tanks closing the encirclement. His division was defending positions along the Dnieper River when Soviet forces attacked from north and south simultaneously. The attack seemed uncoordinated initially, separate thrusts that might be contained. Then, yesterday, Soviet forces met at Zvenigorodka, 30 miles west of Weber's position. The pocket closed. Take 60,000 German soldiers of the 11th Corps and the 42nd Corps are now trapped in a pocket approximately 30 miles in diameter. Radio messages from Army headquarters assure them that relief is coming. 4th Panzer Army is organizing a relief operation. Hold positions, maintain cohesion, await rescue. Weber hears those words and remembers Stalingrad. Different name, different location, same situation. German forces encircled, promises of relief, orders to hold in place. He was fortunate to avoid Stalingrad assignment. Now he's living the same nightmare in a different pocket. The temperature is 15 below 0 Fahrenheit. Supplies are limited, Soviet forces are tightening the ring, and somewhere outside the pocket, Hermann Hoth is attempting to organize another relief operation with inadequate forces. History is repeating as tragedy. And the formation of the Korsun-Cherkasy pocket resulted from the same strategic rigidity that had doomed 6th Army at Stalingrad. Soviet forces had launched offensives north and south of Korsun in mid-January. Professional military judgment suggested German forces should retreat westward before the pincers closed. But Adolf Hitler issued another stand-fast order. 11th Corps and 42nd Corps would hold their positions regardless of encirclement threat. The tactical commanders on the ground, experienced officers who had survived 2 years of Eastern Front combat, argued for withdrawal. They were overruled. On January 28th, when Soviet pincers met at Zvenigorodka, the pocket was complete. Approximately 60,000 German soldiers were trapped, including 6 divisions, 57th, 72nd, 88th, and 89th Infantry Divisions, plus Viking SS Division and Walloon SS Brigade. The pocket was smaller than Stalingrad, but the situation was identical. Encircled forces, inadequate supplies, and promises of relief that would probably fail. Hermann Hoth received orders on January 30th to organize relief of the Korsun pocket using whatever forces 4th Panzer Army could assemble. The irony was brutal and obvious to everyone involved. 18 months earlier, Hoth had attempted to relieve Stalingrad and failed when his forces couldn't advance the final 35 miles to the pocket. Now he was being ordered to do it again, with even fewer resources against a more experienced enemy. Like Hoth's staff calculated what was available: 3rd Panzer Corps, with elements of 11th and 13th Panzer Divisions, approximately 114 operational tanks total. Supporting infantry from various divisions brought total relief force strength to maybe 25,000 men. They would attack Soviet forces that outnumbered them 4-1. The distance from German lines to the pocket's perimeter, approximately 40 miles. The distance Hoth's relief force had reached at Stalingrad before stalling, 35 miles. The mathematics were almost identical, and almost identical mathematics would produce almost identical results. The relief operation, codenamed Wanda, began on February 4th with the 3rd Panzer Corps attacking northward toward the pocket. Initial progress seemed promising. German forces advanced 8 miles the first day, destroying Soviet defensive positions and inflicting substantial casualties. On February 5th, the advance continued another 6 miles. By February 7th, the relief force had covered 18 miles, nearly halfway to the pocket. Radio contact was established with forces inside the pocket. Plans were made for the trapped forces to attack southward toward the relief force to shorten the distance. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that Korsun wouldn't become another Stalingrad, but then Soviet reinforcements arrived. Fresh tank brigades, artillery regiments, and rifle divisions moved into blocking positions between the relief force and the pocket. The advance slowed, then it stopped. The fighting between February 8th and February 11th reduced the relief attempt to attritional slaughter. 3rd Panzer Corps attacked repeatedly, trying to break through Soviet defensive lines. Each attack gained a few hundred meters at the cost of tanks and soldiers that couldn't be replaced. Soviet defenses were configured in depth. Penetrating one defensive line revealed another behind it. Soviet artillery pounded German assembly areas. Soviet aircraft attacked supply convoys. The weather deteriorated with heavy snowfall that reduced visibility and made movement difficult. German tank crews fought in temperatures that froze weapons, immobilized vehicles, and killed wounded soldiers during evacuation. By February 11th, and 3rd Panzer Corps had reached approximately 10 miles from the pocket's perimeter, close enough that soldiers inside the pocket could sometimes hear the sounds of battle, but they might as well have been 100 miles away. The relief force couldn't advance further. Soviet defenses were too strong, German forces too weak. The relief had failed. Inside the Korsun pocket, conditions were deteriorating rapidly. Luftwaffe supply flights attempted to deliver supplies but were hampered by weather and Soviet fighters. Average daily delivery was approximately 60 tons, less than 1/5 of requirements. Soldiers were placed on quarter rations. Horse meat became the primary protein source as horses were slaughtered for food. Ammunition was strictly rationed. Medical supplies ran out, leaving doctors to perform surgery without anesthesia or antiseptics. The wounded froze to death in unheated aid stations. Frostbite cases exceeded combat casualties. Soldiers wrapped themselves in blankets and newspapers for insulation. At night, temperatures dropped to 30 below zero. Men died in their sleep from hypothermia. Morale collapsed as soldiers realized relief wasn't coming. They had been promised rescue. The promises were lies. They were going to die in this frozen pocket because strategic incompetence had put them there and wouldn't let them leave. The decision to attempt breakout without authorization was made by the commanders inside the pocket when they realized relief had failed. On February 15th, Generals Wilhelm Stemmermann and Theobald Lieb, commanding 11th and 42nd Corps respectively, conferred and agreed that remaining in the pocket meant certain death or captivity. They requested permission from higher headquarters to break out. Permission was denied. Hitler ordered the pocket held until relief arrived. But relief had manifestly failed. No further relief attempts were possible. Stemmermann and Lieb made the decision to break out anyway, without orders, accepting that they might face courts-martial if they survived. It was mutiny born of desperation. Break out and possibly survive, or obey orders and certainly die. They chose survival. The breakout was scheduled for the night of February 16th to 17th. Direction: south-southwest toward where 3 Panzer Corps had approached closest. All heavy equipment would be abandoned. This would be an infantry escape through Soviet lines in a snowstorm. The Korsun breakout became a nightmare of violence conducted in darkness and Arctic cold. At approximately 11 p.m. on February 16th, approximately 45,000 German soldiers, the remaining effective strength inside the pocket after casualties and frostbite losses, formed into columns and began moving south. They abandoned tanks, artillery, trucks, and wounded too injured to walk. Soviet forces detected the breakout within hours and responded with artillery fire and infantry attacks. The breakout columns fragmented in the darkness. Small groups became separated and were destroyed or captured. Soldiers stumbled through waist-deep snow, exhausted, freezing, under fire. Soviet cavalry units pursued the retreating Germans, attacking with sabers and shooting fleeing soldiers. The Niloy-Tikich River became a killing ground. Germans attempting to cross the frozen river were caught on the ice by Soviet fire. Hundreds were killed crossing or drowned when the ice broke under the weight of massed soldiers. The survivors who reached German lines numbered approximately 35,000 men who had started the breakout and an estimated 45,000 who had been in the pocket. Approximately 18,000 were killed during the breakout or drowned in the river crossings. Another 7,000 were captured. All heavy equipment was lost. All tanks, all artillery, all vehicles. The men who escaped arrived at German lines in the pitiful condition: frostbitten, wounded, starving, traumatized. Many were barely coherent. Medical personnel struggled to treat the flood of casualties. Hospitals were overwhelmed. And soldiers died from their injuries days after reaching safety. The Korsen pocket had cost Germany approximately 25,000 casualties and destroyed 6 divisions as effective fighting formations. It was Stalingrad, on a smaller scale, but equally catastrophic proportionally. Hermann Hoth's failure to relieve Korsen provided Adolf Hitler with a convenient scapegoat. On February 17th, the same day the breakout concluded, Hoth received orders relieving him of command of 4th Panzer Army. The official reason was the pocket's failure to hold until relief arrived. The actual reason was that Hitler needed to blame someone for the disaster, and field commanders were easier targets than the Führer himself. Hoth's relief was unjust, and everyone involved knew it. He had organized relief with inadequate forces. Night advanced farther than should have been possible, and failed only because the mission was impossible. But justice was irrelevant to political necessity. Hitler couldn't admit that his stand-fast orders created these disasters. Therefore, commanders who failed to overcome impossible odds were relieved. Hoth was replaced by General Erhard Raus. After 33 months commanding 4th Panzer Army through victories and disasters, Hermann Hoth's active combat command ended. He would spend the war's remainder in the Führer Reserve, effectively retirement for a 58-year-old general, still fully competent, but politically inconvenient. The final order Hermann Hoth issued to 4th Panzer Army on February 17th emphasized preservation of force over territorial defense. He instructed his successor to avoid encirclements, conduct fighting withdrawals when necessary, and prioritize keeping units intact rather than holding indefensible positions. It was advice born from painful experience. Hoth had watched 4th Panzer Army fragment and degrade through operational misuse. He had attempted 2 relief operations, Winter Storm and Wanda, and failed both times for the same reason: inadequate forces attempting impossible missions. His final order was essentially, "Don't repeat my mistakes. Don't sacrifice armies for symbolic positions. Don't attempt relief operations with inadequate strength. Don't let ideology override operational reality." The advice was sound. It would largely be ignored. The Wehrmacht's pattern of repeating disasters through ideological rigidity would continue until final collapse. And the symmetry between Stalingrad and Korsen was striking and tragic. Both were encirclements created by Soviet operational art. Both featured trapped German forces ordered to hold rather than break out. Both saw relief attempts that came tantalizingly close but failed to reach the pocket. Both resulted in catastrophic losses. The pocket sizes were even similar. Stalingrad 30 miles in diameter, Korsun 30 miles in diameter. The only significant difference was scale. Stalingrad trapped 290,000 men, Korsun 60,000, but proportionally, the disasters were equivalent, and Hermann Hoth had been intimately involved in both, commanding the relief attempt at Stalingrad, commanding the trapped forces and relief attempt at Korsun. He had lived through Germany's 2 greatest encirclement disasters and failed to prevent either, not because he was incompetent, but because operational competence couldn't overcome strategic stupidity. The master of armored warfare had been reduced to attempting impossible missions with inadequate means, and when he failed at the impossible, he was relieved for not achieving it. The arc of his career and 4th Panzer Army's trajectory had reached its nadir. What remained was only institutional dissolution and final defeat. February 20th, 1944, 4th Panzer Army Headquarters, Uman, Ukraine. Hermann Hoth is packing his personal effects. Maps, documents, and books are being crated for shipment. His dismissal order arrived 3 days ago. His replacement, General Erhard Raus, has already assumed command. And his staff officers visit to pay respects. Quiet conversations acknowledging an unjust relief. Hoth maintains professional demeanor, but his letters reveal bitterness. He commanded 4th Panzer Army for 19 months, through the greatest victories and worst defeats of Germany's Eastern campaign. Now, he's being blamed for failing to achieve the impossible. Outside, the war continues without him. Soviet forces are advancing across Ukraine. 4th Panzer Army, the formation Hoth shaped and commanded, is fragmenting under relentless pressure. Hoth will watch the war's conclusion from the sidelines, placed in the Führer Reserve, where inconvenient generals await assignments that never come. He is 58 years old, professional, competent, and finished as a combat commander. His dismissal isn't about capability, it's about scapegoating, though someone had to be blamed for Korsun. It couldn't be Hitler, therefore it was Hoth. He leaves headquarters on February 22nd. He will never command troops in combat again. The institutional pattern of relieving competent commanders for failures caused by strategic incompetence had accelerated through 1943 and 44. Hermann Hoth was merely the latest in a series of dismissals that removed professional expertise in favor of ideological compliance. Heinz Guderian had been relieved in December 1941 for recommending retreat from Moscow. Erich Hopner was relieved and dismissed from the army entirely for conducting unauthorized withdrawals. Fedor von Bock was relieved for similar reasons. As the pattern was clear, commanders who advocated professional military solutions to strategic problems were removed when those problems resulted in defeats. Commanders who unquestioningly obeyed Hitler's orders, regardless of operational realities, retained their positions. This institutional dynamic created perverse incentives. Professional competence became a liability if it conflicted with ideological directives. By early 1944, the Wehrmacht's senior leadership consisted increasingly of officers selected for compliance rather than capability. Hermann Hoth's placement in the Führer Reserve in March 1944 meant effective retirement despite his relatively young age and continued competence. That the Führer Reserve was where Hitler stored generals who had been relieved but couldn't be outright dismissed, men with sufficient reputation that firing them would create political problems. Officers in the Führer Reserve theoretically awaited new assignments. In practice, they rarely received them. Hoth spent spring and summer 1944 waiting for orders that never came. He was occasionally consulted on operational matters but held no command authority. He watched the war from the sidelines as Germany's strategic position collapsed. The Normandy invasion in June, the destruction of Army Group Center in Operation Bagration, the failed July 20th assassination attempt against Hitler. Hoth was geographically and operationally distant from these events. He had been one of Germany's premier armored commanders, and now he was a spectator. The December 1944 approach about commanding 6th SS Panzer Army for the Ardennes offensive revealed how thoroughly Hoth had been marginalized. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last major offensive in the West, required experienced armored commanders. Hoth had pioneered German armored doctrine and commanded the Wehrmacht's largest panzer army for nearly 2 years. He was an obvious choice. When quietly approached about the position, Hoth declined. His stated reasons were age and health. The actual reasons were professional and ethical. Hoth knew the Ardennes offensive was a strategic fantasy. Germany lacked the fuel, industrial capacity, and air superiority necessary for an offensive through the Ardennes to Antwerp. The operation would consume Germany's last reserves and achieve nothing decisive. Hoth refused to associate himself with an operation he considered doomed. It was a rare moment of resistance to a regime he had served loyally. The position went to Sepp Dietrich, an SS officer with political connections but limited operational competence. The Ardennes offensive proceeded as Hoth predicted: initial surprise, some tactical gains, strategic failure, and wastage of irreplaceable forces. The destruction of 4th Panzer Army, the formation Hoth had commanded, occurred gradually through spring 1944 in battles Hoth watched from distance. General Raus commanded 4th Panzer Army capably but couldn't overcome the operational realities. Soviet numerical superiority was overwhelming. German logistics were collapsing. Replacement flows had stopped. By April, and 4th Panzer Army existed primarily on organizational charts. Its divisions were shadows of authorized strength. Its tank inventory had fallen to double digits. On May 8th, Rouse was reassigned and replaced by General Walter Harpe. Harpe commanded 4th Panzer Army until June, when he too was reassigned. Through summer and autumn 1944, 4th Panzer Army had 7 different commanders in 15 months, compared to Hoth's 19-month tenure. The constant command changes reflected institutional chaos. No commander stayed long enough to shape the formation or develop coherent operational doctrine. 4th Panzer Army became a designation applied to whatever units happened to be assigned to Army Group Center at any given moment. By April 1945, 4th Panzer Army remnants were trapped in Czechoslovakia, facing Soviet forces advancing toward Prague. The army that had once commanded over 1,000 tanks now possessed perhaps 12 operational vehicles. Infantry divisions existed as regimental combat groups. Artillery batteries had more crews than guns. Supply was non-existent. The formation was disintegrating not through combat, but through desertion, surrender, and unit-level collapses. Individual soldiers and entire units decided that continued resistance was pointless and surrendered to advancing Soviet or American forces. Officers lost control of their commands. The organizational structure that had held through years of retreat finally dissolved. 4th Panzer Army ceased to exist as a functional formation sometime in late April. Exact dates are unclear because record-keeping had collapsed. The army simply evaporated through the chaos of Germany's final defeat. Hermann Hoth observed the final collapse from Bavaria, where he had relocated his family. Soviet forces were advancing from the east, American forces from the west. Germany was being crushed between 2 overwhelming opponents. Final defeat was certain. Hoth avoided involvement in the scattered last-stand efforts some units attempted. He had been a professional soldier his entire adult life. He understood when wars were lost. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. Hoth surrendered to American forces in Bavaria without resistance. He was taken into custody as a prisoner of war, a high-ranking Wehrmacht general subject to potential war crimes prosecution. His military career was over. His legal troubles were beginning. But he had survived, which was more than could be said for hundreds of thousands of soldiers who had served under his command in 4th Panzer Army. The post-war Nuremberg trials prosecuted senior Wehrmacht officers for war crimes, including participation in or knowledge of atrocities committed during the Eastern Campaign. Hermann Hoth was tried and convicted in the High Command trial of 1948. The charges included complicity in implementing the Commissar Order, Hitler's directive to execute Soviet political officers rather than treating them as prisoners of war. Hoth's defense argued he had not personally ordered or participated in executions. The prosecution argued that, as a senior commander, he was responsible for crimes committed by units under his command even if he didn't directly order them. The tribunal convicted Hoth and sentenced him to 15 years imprisonment. The sentence recognized his operational competence while holding him accountable for the criminal regime he served. Hoth served 6 years before being released in 1954 during a general reduction of sentences for convicted Wehrmacht officers. Hoth's post-imprisonment life was quiet and largely unremarkable. He wrote memoirs focusing on operational aspects of the Eastern campaigns while avoiding political or ideological topics. His writings emphasized logistical and strategic errors that had doomed German operations rather than examining the criminal nature of the war itself. The memoirs became reference materials for military historians and professional officers studying armored warfare. Hoth never apologized for his service or expressed regret about the war beyond tactical and operational errors. His perspective remained that of a professional soldier who had executed orders to the best of his ability in service of strategic objectives he hadn't chosen. This limited perspective was typical of many Wehrmacht commanders who compartmentalized professional military service from the genocidal ideology the military served. Hoth died in 1971 at age 85, having outlived most of his contemporaries in the army he had served. The statistical summary of 4th Panzer Army under Hoth's command reveals the scale of operations and casualties. From July 1942 to February 1944, 19 months, 4th Panzer Army operated across southern Russia and Ukraine, conducting offensive and defensive operations spanning approximately 1,500 miles of front over the campaign's duration. The army commanded approximately 500,000 different soldiers over its existence when counting replacements and attached units. Casualties totaled approximately 350,000, killed, wounded, missing, and permanently disabled. Tank losses exceeded 10,000 vehicles when counting original equipment and replacements. The Army inflicted estimated 800,000 Soviet casualties during its operations, but at unsustainable cost to itself. These numbers represent human tragedy on industrial scales, lives destroyed, families shattered, nay, potential unrealized. Behind the statistics were individuals: the tank commander killed at Prokhorovka, the infantryman frozen at Stalingrad, the wounded soldier who died during evacuation from Korsun. The comparison between Hoth and his contemporary Panzer commanders illuminates different trajectories through the war. Heinz Guderian, often called the father of German armored warfare, was relieved in 1941, recalled in 1943 as Inspector General of Armored Troops, then appointed Chief of General Staff in 1944. He survived the war and wrote influential memoirs. Erwin Rommel achieved legendary status in North Africa before being implicated in the July 20th plot and forced to commit suicide. And Ewald von Kleist commanded 1st Panzer Army through the Eastern campaigns before being captured by the Soviets and dying in captivity. Of Hitler's original Panzer Army commanders from Barbarossa, only Guderian remained in position by 1945, not commanding troops, but serving as Chief of General Staff, a position where his objections to Hitler's decisions were consistently overruled. The pattern was that professional competence eventually conflicted with ideological rigidity, leading to relief or worse. Hoth's trajectory, brilliant early success, operational excellence unable to overcome strategic incompetence, relief for failing at impossible missions, was typical of Wehrmacht commanders in the East. Hermann Hoth's final years involved no public controversy or significant historical revision of his role. He remained a professional soldier in his own conception, a technician of armored warfare who had executed operations as ordered. This self-conception ignored the larger context of those operations. A war of annihilation aimed at destroying the Soviet state and exterminating millions of people deemed racially inferior. Hoth served that war competently, without questioning its fundamental criminality. His legacy is therefore complex. An innovator in armored doctrine whose innovations served genocidal purposes, a competent commander whose competence prolonged a criminal war, a professional soldier whose professionalism was placed in service of evil. Understanding Hoth requires holding multiple truths simultaneously: that he was genuinely skilled at armored operations and that those skills were deployed for indefensible purposes. His story, and 4th Panzer Army's story, are inseparable from the larger tragedy of the Eastern Front, where tactical and operational excellence served strategic criminality, where professional military competence enabled unprecedented atrocities, where individual skill was subordinated to collective evil. That complexity resists simple moral judgments, but demands serious reckoning with how institutions and individuals function within criminal systems. May 8, 1945. Prague, Czechoslovakia. The war in Europe is over. Germany has surrendered unconditionally. In a warehouse on Prague's outskirts, Soviet soldiers are cataloging captured German equipment. Among the wreckage, 12 tanks bearing the tactical markings of 4th Panzer Army. These are all that remain of a formation that once commanded over 1,000 tanks. Yet the Soviets photographed the vehicles for intelligence purposes, then marked them for scrapping. Nearby, approximately 8,000 German soldiers, the final remnants of 4th Panzer Army, are being processed as prisoners of war. They are exhausted, malnourished, and defeated. Most have been retreating for over a year. Many have served since the formation's creation in June 1942. They represent the human residue of organizational dissolution. 4th Panzer Army, which had advanced victoriously across southern Russia in summer 42, besieged Stalingrad in autumn, attempted desperate relief in winter, fought at Kursk in summer 43, and retreated across Ukraine through 44, has reached the end of its existence. The formation will be officially disbanded, its history will be studied, its legacy will be debated. But the army itself is finished. The immediate post-war Soviet analysis of 4th Panzer Army's operations became foundational documents in Soviet military education. The Frunze Military Academy in Moscow produced detailed studies of Case Blue, the Stalingrad campaign, Kursk, and 4th Panzer Army's defensive operations. These weren't exercises in celebrating Soviet victory, but serious examinations of German operational methods. Soviet military theorists recognized that 4th Panzer Army, particularly under Hoth's command, had demonstrated sophisticated combined arms operations, effective use of armor in both offensive and defensive roles, and remarkable ability to maintain cohesion under extreme pressure. The 1947 Soviet General Staff study titled Operational Employment of Mechanized Forces, German Case Studies, cited 4th Panzer Army's Case Blue Offensive as an exemplar of sustainable armored operations, noting how improved logistics and combined arms coordination had produced better results than the more famous but logistically unsustainable early Barbarossa advances. American and British military education incorporated 4th Panzer Army operations into professional military curricula surprisingly quickly after the war. By 1953, the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth was teaching Case Blue as a case study in armored operations. The course examined how 4th Panzer Army had maintained operational tempo through improved logistics, how it had coordinated multiple divisions across extended fronts, and how it had transitioned from offense to defense when strategic situations changed. The American analysis was clinical, focused on operational and tactical lessons while largely avoiding political or moral contexts. This reflected Cold War pragmatism. The United States and Soviet Union were now enemies, and understanding how to fight armored warfare against Soviet forces meant studying the last people who had done it, the Wehrmacht. Hermann Hoth's tactical innovations and operational methods were thus preserved and studied by the very nations that had defeated him. The statistical life cycle of 4th Panzer Army from June 1942 to May 1945 provides quantitative framework for understanding the formation's trajectory. The total personnel who served in the 4th Panzer Army over its existence, approximately 500,000 soldiers when counting replacements, attached units, and rotations. Total casualties, approximately 350,000, 70% casualty rate over the formation's existence. Total tanks operated, approximately 12,000 vehicles when counting original equipment and all replacements. Total tanks lost to all causes, approximately 10,800, 90% loss rate. Geographic scope of operations, from the Donets River in Russia to Prague in Czechoslovakia, spanning approximately 1,500 miles of front over 33 months of existence. Engagements fought, hundreds of named battles, and thousands of unnamed skirmishes, sieges, and defensive actions. The numbers describe an organization that was continuously destroying and reconstituting itself, grinding through personnel and equipment at rates that guaranteed eventual exhaustion. NATO Cold War planning in the 1980s incorporated lessons from 4th Panzer Army's defensive operations against Soviet offensives. Western military planners studying how to defend Western Europe against potential Soviet armored assault examined 4th Panzer Army's mobile defense tactics from 1943 and 44. The techniques Hoth had pioneered, using armor to counterattack penetrations, trading space for time, avoiding encirclement through timely withdrawal, became elements of NATO's defensive doctrine. This created an odd historical recursion. Soviet forces in the 1980s were training to conduct offensives using operational methods developed partly by studying their own operations against 4th Panzer Army, while NATO forces were training to defend using methods 4th Panzer Army had developed, defending against those same Soviet forces. The operational knowledge generated in the crucible of the Eastern Front had become universal military knowledge, studied and applied by all sides regardless of political allegiance. The moral reassessment of Wehrmacht commanders, including Hoth, accelerated in German historiography from the 1990s onward, and earlier West German military histories had tended toward the clean Wehrmacht myth, presenting German armed forces as professional military organizations separate from Nazi ideology and atrocities. Later, scholarship demolished this myth through archival research. Studies demonstrated that Wehrmacht units, including 4th Panzer Army, had been complicit in or directly participated in war crimes. The Commissar Order, anti-partisan operations that targeted civilians, cooperation with Einsatzgruppen, death squads, and logistical support for genocidal operations all implicated the Wehrmacht directly in Nazi criminality. Hermann Hoth's command tenure included periods when units under 4th Panzer Army's operational control committed or facilitated atrocities. His conviction at Nuremberg was thus professionally and morally warranted despite his operational competence. The legacy comparison between 4th Panzer Army and other major armored formations reveals its historical significance. Guderian's Panzer Group. 2/2nd Panzer Army was perhaps more famous but operated primarily in 1941 before Guderian's relief. Rommel's Afrika Korps achieved legendary status, but never exceeded divisional strength and operated in a secondary theater. Kleist's 1st Panzer Army conducted important operations, but lacked 4th Panzer Army's geographic scope and operational diversity. 4th Panzer Army under Hoth's command represented German armored warfare at its most developed, combining tactical excellence with improved logistics, conducting operations across multiple years and thousands of miles, demonstrating capability in both offense and defense. That this excellence served criminal strategic goals doesn't negate the operational lessons, but does contextualize them. Military effectiveness in service of evil remains evil, however effectively executed. Soviet military historians cited 4th Panzer Army operations in 78 post-war tactical studies between 1945 and 1991, more than any other German formation. This reflects the Army's operational significance and the quality of its documentation. German military record-keeping was meticulous even during retreat and defeat. War diaries, after-action reports, and operational orders survived in Soviet archives, providing detailed primary sources. Its Soviet theorists used these documents to understand German operational methods, identify successful Soviet countermeasures, and develop doctrinal improvements. The studies were classified during the Cold War, but became available to researchers after the Soviet Union's collapse. They reveal Soviet military culture's emphasis on learning from adversaries, studying what worked for the Germans to ensure Soviet forces could counter it, and studying what failed for the Germans to avoid repeating those errors. The contemporary historical debate about Wehrmacht commanders focuses on the relationship between professional military competence and service to criminal regimes. Hermann Hoth represents this tension perfectly. He was undeniably competent. His tactical innovations, operational flexibility, and ability to maintain unit cohesion under extreme pressure were genuine professional achievements. He wasn't an ideological fanatic like some SS commanders or an incompetent political appointee. He was a professional soldier, applying professional skills to operational problems. But those skills and that professionalism enabled a war of annihilation that killed tens of millions of people. Does technical competence in service of evil mitigate or compound culpability? The question resists easy answers, but demands engagement. Hoth spent his career mastering armored warfare. Those skills facilitated genocidal operations. Professional excellence doesn't excuse moral failure. Understanding Hoth requires acknowledging both his competence and his complicity. The question of what modern militaries should learn from 4th Panzer Army remains contentious. Tactical and operational lessons, combined arms coordination, logistics planning, defensive maneuvers, are universally applicable and politically neutral. Professional military education can study these aspects without endorsing the cause they served. But this clinical approach risks sanitizing history, extracting useful techniques while ignoring the criminal context of their application. The alternative, refusing to study Wehrmacht operations because they served evil, discards valuable military knowledge but maintains moral clarity. Most professional military education attempts a middle path, studying the operations while explicitly contextualizing them within the criminal war they enabled. This allows professional learning while maintaining moral awareness, but the tension remains unresolved. Can you truly separate technique from purpose when technique enabled purpose? The debate continues in military education institutions globally. The human cost of 4th Panzer Army's operations extends far beyond military casualties. Approximately 350,000 German soldiers who served in 4th Panzer Army were killed, wounded, or missing, each representing individual tragedy and family grief. Soviet military casualties inflicted by 4th Panzer Army numbered approximately 800,000, a conservative estimate given incomplete records. Soviet civilian casualties in areas where 4th Panzer Army operated are harder to quantify, but certainly exceeded military losses. Civilians died from combat, starvation, disease, execution, and forced labor. Cities were destroyed, infrastructure was demolished, agricultural production collapsed, causing famines. The Donbass region, southern Ukraine, and parts of Russia where 4th Panzer Army fought were devastated and required decades to recover. Quantifying this suffering numerically is necessary for historical understanding, but risks reducing human tragedy to statistics. Behind every number was a person whose life was destroyed or ended by war. The final historical judgment on 4th Panzer Army and Hermann Hoth must balance multiple perspectives: tactical competence, operational innovation, strategic failure, and moral culpability. Hoth pioneered important developments in armored warfare that influenced military doctrine globally. That 4th Panzer Army demonstrated both the potential and limitations of mechanized forces in sustained operations. These are legitimate historical legacies deserving study. But they exist inseparably from the context, a criminal war of annihilation. 4th Panzer Army's operations enabled and participated in that criminality. No amount of tactical excellence excuses serving genocidal purposes. Understanding this history requires holding contradictions, that military organizations can be simultaneously professionally competent and morally reprehensible, that individual soldiers can demonstrate courage and skill in service of evil causes, that studying technique doesn't require endorsing purpose. To 4th Panzer Army's trajectory from triumph to destruction encapsulates the entire Wehrmacht experience. Tactical excellence rendered strategically irrelevant by material reality and morally indefensible by ideological criminality. That trajectory offers lessons for military professionals about the limits of operational skill when disconnected from strategic wisdom. It offers lessons for citizens about how institutional competence can serve monstrous ends. And it offers lessons for historians about the necessity of understanding the past completely, its technical aspects, its human dimensions, its moral failures, rather than selectively extracting comfortable narratives. The echoes of 4th Panzer Army persist in military education, historical memory, and ongoing debates about war, competence, and complicity. The ashes remain scattered across Eastern Europe, where 500,000 soldiers fought and died in operations that combined operational artistry with strategic catastrophe and moral failure. Understanding both, the artistry and the catastrophe, the competence and the criminality, is essential for comprehending how wars are fought and why they should be avoided.